Ladies and gentlemen, as the event will be commencing shortly, may we request for all guests to gradually take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat as we will be commencing the event now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the GenZero Climate Summit Insights 2025 Transition Credits Forum. We will now play the video.
Throughout history, humankind believed in a multitude of truths.
The sun revolves around the earth.
The Earth is flat.
Which were later proven by science to be inaccurate. Today, there are those who deny that climate change is real and question the severity of global warming and sea level rises. George Bernard Shaw once said, "The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is false knowledge."
It is not a question of climate denial. It is a question of climate paralysis. That is where we are now. The question, however, is what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do?
When you try your best but you don't succeed, when you get what you want but not what you need, when you feel so tired but you can't sleep, stuck in rivers. And high up above or down below, when you're too in love to let it go. But if you never try, you'll never know just what you were. Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones. And I will try to fix you. lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try.
We are, after all, the greatest problem solvers to have ever existed on Earth.
To fix you.
Mabuhay and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the GenZero Climate Summit Insights 2025 Transition Credits Forum. I am Brian Yap, Vice President of Investments at GenZero, and I'm delighted to be your MC for this afternoon. We are excited to have you here for the GenZero Climate Summit Insights Transition Credits Forum, held in collaboration with ASEAN and DBS Bank. This is the very first time we are holding the GenZero Climate Summit Insights abroad, and it only seems fitting that we bring this discussion around transition credits to the Philippines, which has been a pioneering partner in their energy transition efforts. Asia stands at a pivotal juncture as the population here continues to grow, and correspondingly, we expect energy demand to rise as well. However, therein lies a critical opportunity in the form of transition credits. By strategically leveraging transition credits, we can unlock the financial pathway needed to accelerate the early retirement of coal assets and replace them with cleaner, more sustainable energy systems. Over the course of this afternoon, we hope to dive into lively discussions on how robust methodology, innovative financing solutions, and strong collaboration can build a credible and high-integrity transition credit market. On that note, we are very honored to have with us today Secretary Rafael Lottier from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to deliver our opening keynote. May I invite you to join me in putting your hands together to welcome Secretary Lottier on stage, please.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, good afternoon, everyone. I was hoping that after you, Secte, joined you for a number of you for lunch, that then that would spare me from having to deliver this speech. Nevertheless, let me proceed then to outline some of the thoughts that we wanted to share with you this afternoon. At COP28, parties adopted a landmark decision to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems, marking the first time such language was formally recognized in a UNFCCC outcome. This reflects a growing global consensus, but also persistent divergence between climate-vulnerable nations and countries heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Countries' views on phasing out fossil fuels vary significantly. A number advocate for a rapid and complete phase-out. Other countries qualify their support for a phase-out, emphasizing the importance of considering national circumstances, ensuring global access for their populations, and deploying technologies like carbon capture and storage to mitigate emissions. These nations often face significant economic challenges and rely heavily on fossil fuels for their development. Still, a smaller number of countries actively disagree with the complete phase-out, and these nations are often major fossil fuel producers and have made substantial investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. The global landscape regarding the phase out of fossil fuels is complex and multifaceted. The consensus achieved on the need to transition away from fossil fuels needs to be translated at the country level with due consideration of economic, social, and political factors. As a country, the Philippines is both highly vulnerable to climate change impact and at the same time heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And there lies, of course, the dilemma that we always have to grapple with. The first global stocktake concluded under the Paris Agreement provided a sobering assessment. The stocktake clearly demonstrated that current national efforts are insufficient to meet the agreement's long-term temperature goals. Beyond numbers, the GST delivers a stark message. Decisions made in this decade will reverberate for generations. To succeed, we must pursue transformative change, not incremental shifts across energy, transport, food systems, and finance. At the same time, we need to emphasize that the greater burden in this collective challenge lies in the hands of the developed countries, which have both the financial heft as well as the technological access. Parties agreed to update their nationally determined contributions and are expected to include strategies for transitioning away from fossil fuels. For the Philippines, the government is undertaking a comprehensive update of our 2021 NDC submission. This process is more than just a reporting obligation. It is a strategic recalibration of our national ambition, informed by the latest science, sectoral realities, and the imperative to accelerate decarbonization while safeguarding development gains. In other words, we will do what we can as responsible members of the international community. For the energy sector, the updating of the NDC is aligned with the Philippine Energy Plan and focuses on policy measures that promote renewable energy and energy efficiency. And my colleagues from the department are here. So Yusek Wimpy will have to commit us to that. These are essential levers for deep decarbonization, and they offer co-benefits for energy security, economic competitiveness, and inclusive growth. But they require bold investments, enabling policies, and sustained collaboration across all levels of government and society. It is noted our current NDC estimates a financing need of at least $72 billion across key sectors: energy, transport, waste, agriculture, and industry. Mobilizing this capital through public, private, and international sources is critical to achieve the target reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from these sectors. Hence, mobilization and provision of finance, technology, and capacity building to enable ambitious climate action needs to be accelerated. Today, the focus of the forum is the innovative concept of transition credits and their potential to unlock financial mechanisms for the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. These transition credits represent a market-based approach to incentivizing the decommissioning of coal plants, thus avoiding carbon emissions, improving air quality, and enhancing public health. Around the world, interest in carbon markets is growing, with 83% of NDCs stating the intent to make use of international market mechanisms that offer incentives on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. They are an emerging financial instrument that can provide the necessary incentive for countries with large coal-fired power generation capacity to transition to friendly sources of energy. We are already seeing partnerships emerge in this space, such as the collaboration between GenZero and ASEAN to explore transition credits for the South Luzon Thermal Energy Corporation in Batangas. This project serves as a model for how we can leverage innovative financing mechanisms to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. Policies and incentives are needed to improve the economics of early phase-out. Carbon markets are part of the broader assembly of tools, and transition credits are emerging as one promising solution to address the value loss. Proposed executive order issuances to establish policy framework on voluntary carbon and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are being formulated by the different agencies of government. The policy also proposes designating DNR as the National Carbon Market Authority to put in place institutional mechanisms that will ensure the integrity and transparency of carbon market activities and the protection of the environment. The proposed executive issuances include providing the framework for exploring the strategic use of transition credits, a mechanism to support sectors in shifting from high emission practices to cleaner alternatives, and consultations with civil society organizations, private sector, and national government agencies have also just been completed. The draft DNR administrative order aims to guide the establishment, management, and monitoring of forest carbon credit projects in forest lands, protected areas, and national parks in the country. The draft order also proposes a plan for community benefit sharing for a forest carbon credit project with local communities and indigenous peoples. The Philippine government also entered into a memorandum of understanding with the government of Singapore to collaborate on carbon credits, and an implementation agreement is jointly being formulated to provide a bilateral framework for cooperation on these activities. So may I congratulate, therefore, the government of Singapore through Her Excellency Ambassador Constancy and Ambassador Ravi for your first implementation agreement with an ASEAN country, which is Thailand. And I was telling Ambassador Ravi that puts the pressure off of the Philippines, and perhaps we can look forward to another year of working on an agreement. But this partnership, of course, we are serious about it and reflects our commitment to high-end integrity international cooperation and opens doors for investment. To ensure that transition credits are credible, effective, and contribute to a just and sustainable energy transition, policies should consider key challenges such as the risk of reversal, impermanence, and leakage. And robust mechanisms, therefore, have to be in place to prevent the premature return of retired coal plants to operation. The climate benefits of retiring coal plants must be guaranteed for the long term, and we must ensure that retiring while coal plant does not simply lead to increased emissions elsewhere. The DNR will strengthen the social and environmental dimensions of the energy transition. The phase-out of fossil fuels must be managed in a way that protects the environment, supports affected communities, and promotes social equity. Environmental remediation, such as restoring land and remediation of coal-contaminated sites, including coal ash cleanup, must be prioritized by backing them up with science-based studies and appropriate technology. The promotion of transition credits should result to concrete support to just transition for workers and affected communities. The Philippine government is leading the development of a national just transition framework that will guide our efforts to minimize disruptions for labor and communities dependent on fossil fuel industries as they transition to new economic opportunities. The government recognizes the crucial role of financial mechanisms, including sustainability and transition credits, in supporting environmental sustainability and facilitating a just and equitable transition to a low-carbon economy. Through our collaborative efforts, let us go beyond carbon finance by promoting financing that incentivizes private capital to invest in low-carbon industries and initiatives. All stakeholders should work together to accelerate the energy transition in the Philippines. And I wish, therefore, to extend my congratulations to the organizers and to the companies and institutions involved. By mobilizing significant investments, we can build a cleaner, more prosperous, and more equitable future for all. The Philippines stands ready to work for its realization with you. Thank you very much, and a good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you, Secretary Lotia, for helping us to set the stage for this afternoon's discussion with your insightful opening address. May I please request for you to remain on stage for a group photo with our panelists for the next panel. Mr. Ravi Menon, Mr. Eric Frencher, Mr. Lim Wee Sing, and Mr. Frederick Teo, may we please request for you to join our guest of honor on stage for the photo opportunity, please. Thank you once again, Secretary Lotia, for delivering the opening address. May I please request for the panelists to remain on stage and take your seats for the opening panel discussion.
I think when you see the photos, you'll know who we are. I think it's kind of obvious. Starting with some of the more handsome gentlemen over here, and then you are left with me on the end. So that will be fine. Okay. Very good afternoon, everybody. And thank you once again to Secretary Lotia for gracing the occasion and delivering a wonderful context-setting opening address. First of all, let me begin by thanking our organizing partners and our JV partners, right? DBS, ASEN, DGA, as well as Keppel, for working with us on such an important project. Now, today, our first session is talking about the case for transition credits. I should start by perhaps laying a little bit of a context of why we are gathered here today. So for about a year now, I imagine, right, Eric? We have been coming together as a group, as a project team, to actually study how we could be advancing the early transition out of the coal plant in South Luzon. But this work actually predates this particular project. I know that Eric has already been working on this for quite some time before that. And I must say that the genesis of some of these transition credits ideas actually came from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which Ravi led prior to him taking on this new appointment as the climate change ambassador. So there is actually a lot of thinking around why we need to do this. So I propose that we organize our session today, gentlemen, if you will, by maybe covering a few sections. The first one, I think we would start by understanding why transition is even important in Asia. Why is it important to deal with this issue around early phase out for coal plants? Then I think we move on to a next segment that we'll talk about like why transition credits would be an important way of helping with that transition. And at that point in time, I also want to draw in a financing component to it as to like how we can finance the transition. Then the third part of it, I think we will talk about some of the practical challenges and opportunities that will come from doing something like that, and including touching on a very important topic of the just transition, right? So if I may kick it off right now, then I'll turn first to Ravi, because obviously it started with a lot of work that MES did on thinking about how to actually finance a transition, and it originated in the concept of the transition credits. So perhaps, Ravi, you can kick us off by providing a big picture view on why this is important and how the MES got involved in this whole thing and why we are pushing this idea of transition credits.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for putting this together with ASEN. It's a very timely issue that we should be discussing. So let me start with, you saw the video, which I think was quite powerful, about climate change. It's not a prediction, it is current reality. It is only going to get much worse. We can make it a little less worse if we do some things right, but it's going to get worse. And so, as a small tropical city-state, Singapore is deeply vulnerable to climate change. So we are committed to reach net zero by 2050 as part of our contribution. But Singapore is just 0.1% of global emissions. And we asked ourselves, what is it that we can do to ease Asia's transition? Just as we contribute towards the global trading system, global financial system, what can we do for the global climate action? And so a few data points were staring at us. One, there is no way the world will reach net zero in 2050 if Asia does not decarbonize. Asia already accounts for slightly more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions today. Its share is going to increase because Asia is growing faster than every other region in the world, energy demand in particular. So if you don't solve Asia's problem, we're not going to solve the global problem. Second, the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Asia, two largest contributors. One is coal-fired power plants. Two, deforestation. These are the two. So you need to fix these two problems. Now let's come down one step further. Focus on coal-fired power plants. 1 out of 7 tons of greenhouse gas emissions that go up into the atmosphere today comes from coal-fired power plants in Asia. So what do we do about them? It's an economic problem, primarily. Now, it's easy to say, shut down the coal plants and switch to solar, because solar is now even cheaper than coal in many parts of the world. Yes, solar panel prices have come down 90% over the last 15 years. It is indeed, in many parts of the world, cheaper. But there are a lot of unique problems in Asia that make that replacement very difficult. One, the coal fleet in Asia is very young. It's got about 30 years more on average to run. No, it doesn't make economic sense because these are backed up by powerful power purchase agreements. People have invested capex, and you can't just shut them down. Second, they are today providing electricity to millions of people. 60% of Asia's energy consumption comes from coal plants. And I just realized the same number is true of the Philippines, 60% from coal plants. You can't just shut them down. People depend on it for electricity. Added to that, energy demand is expected to double by 2050 in Asia. So you have rising energy demand and great dependence on coal. And the third factor, about 150 million people in Asia still do not have access to electricity. You put the three together, it makes this a very, very difficult proposition to shut them down immediately. Can you leave them and just meet new demand with renewables? No, that won't work either. Because if you leave these plants to continue emitting emissions, CO2, that's going to eat up most of the carbon budget we have remaining if we're having any chance of keeping global temperatures 1.5 or 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So this is the complex set of problems that makes it very difficult. The solution is to manage the phase out. You can't leave them forever. You can't shut them down immediately. You got to bring forward the shutdown date, the decommissioning early, by 10 years, 15 years, or even 20 years. Then you have substantive reductions in CO2 without necessarily shutting them down completely today. So that was the proposition that we had. The coal managed phase out of coal. A lot of work was done on this, not just at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, but also by GFANS as one of the key pieces that we need to solve for. Now, then the financing becomes difficult. And this is where transition credits come in. Because what is the incentive for these plants to shut down 10 or 15 years earlier? It has to be through a new class of carbon credits that recognizes the reduction in CO2 as a result of the early decommissioning, and for which buyers of credits, be they corporates or sovereigns, are willing to pay. And so if you can structure the financing of these of this early phase out using carbon credits or energy transition credits, then we have a forward way. So we did work on that, came up with the methodologies, and now we're on the way of piloting these projects. And pilots are important because you need to demonstrate this works in practice. This is not just theory. And that's where the only 2 pilots in the world for early phase out of coal are both in the Philippines. There's one in South Luzon, SLTech. There's one in Mindanao. We've got to make these pilots work, learn from them. There will inevitably be deficiencies, do a next series of pilots, and scale this across the Philippines and eventually across Asia.
Thanks a lot, Ravi. I think that has been a fairly good overview around the central challenge of why we need to address coal plants. But as what Ravi has said, Eric, clearly there are still a lot of communities that actually depend on the power and electricity that coal plants actually provide. And the Philippines obviously will have that dependence and the reliance also on coal as part of its power sector. So maybe you can share with us why ASEN would be keen on looking at this coal to clean kind of an initiative. What motivated ASEN to initially even think about accelerating already before this pilot, an early phase out of the coal plant through an ETM kind of a financing mechanism, and then now participating in this pilot?
Thanks, Fred, and thanks for organizing this important event. As many of you know, ASEN is the renewable energy platform of the Ayala Group, which is one of the largest and longest-standing business groups in the Philippines. We didn't start as a renewable energy platform. We always aspired. In the beginning, we set up the energy group in 2011. We always had that aspiration of being 100% renewables, but we quickly realized after our first investment that renewables was not the answer 14 years ago in the context of the Philippines. We ended up building coal plants because what the country needed was reliable, affordable energy. And unfortunately, at that time, coal was the only answer to support the very fast growth in the Philippines. That was a pragmatic move, but we believe that was the right one. So we got from 0 to 1,000 megawatts in 5 years, which was our target. But the not so good news was we were 93% coal-based and 7% renewables from an ASEN platform. But 7, 8 years ago, we felt the world shifting. Renewables was getting more competitive. ESG investing was getting more mainstream. And we thought that that was a great opportunity for us to make that bold pivot. And pivot we did. We started to divest our coal plants and basically invest everything into renewables in the Philippines, and we started to branch out regionally with the help of our partners, particularly Mitsubishi and DGA, who invited us into their investment in Indonesia, and then eventually we also expanded into Vietnam, India, Laos, as well as Australia. So we became a regional renewable platform. We had a simplistic thinking back then of divesting coal and expanding renewables, which in and of itself is already a noble initiative. But some investors and like-minded individuals called us out and said, aren't you just passing the problem to somebody else when you divest the coal plant? And that presents a valid point. That's why we were thankful in 2021 when the Asian Development Bank started to push the notion of energy transition mechanism, which is really a financing mechanism leveraging low-cost, purpose-driven financing to help with the phase-out of coal plants. We quickly latched on to that opportunity. And long story short, we got the support of our shareholders, various stakeholders, and especially the banks and new investors like insurance companies to basically put in that capital in exchange for us committing to shut down and retire the coal plant after 25 years of operations, which is 2040. SLTech, which is the plant that many of you will be visiting tomorrow, was a plant, it's close to my heart because that was the very first power plant that I built in my power career, and I had zero experience in 2011. This was new to me, a new industry, and SLTech was the first coal plant that I was participating in terms of building. And now I'm tasked to also, with the help of Migs, who's the president here, to retire it in a responsible manner, no later than 2040. So while that was a success, we were encouraged by our stakeholders, including ADB. But Eric, to Ravi's point earlier, for the world to keep to the 1.5 degree target, the world has to shut down half of the fossil fuel fleet globally, which is a very daunting task, right? So we said, and therefore, can we accelerate it by 10 years, by 2030? We said it's impossible except if there is a financing mechanism, and we'll keep an open mind. At that time, carbon credits for early coal retirement did not exist. I didn't know about the initiatives of MAS. Ambassador Ravi was already thinking about this alongside with Rockefeller Foundation. We didn't know that. But we gave ourselves the optionality, not the obligation, but the option to buy back the power plant, SLTech, by as early as 2030, just in case this initiative emerged. That's why we were very delighted to hear in July 2023 for MAS and Rockefeller Foundation to make that big announcement supported by a McKinsey study and began pushing the notion of transition credits. And by COP 28, we signed the cooperation intent to collaborate to pilot test the world's first transition credits pilot project. So here we are today, almost 2 years into the bar. We've done a lot of made a lot of progress and milestones. Obviously, the G2G agreement is a critical one. We will do this only under Article 6 because of the high quality, high integrity nature of this initiative. We are here and glad to be supported by groups like NAT, whom we'll hear from later on, the Kinetic Coalition, and of course the various governments, the sovereign off-takers, which we're happy to discuss later on. But this is truly a whole-of-system approach, a partnership approach to enable this very important pilot initiative.
Well, thanks a lot, Eric. I mean, now that we have heard around the motivations, around why it's so important to address the coal transition problem, maybe I turn to Wee Sing. And Wee Sing, you in the bank, you are financing a lot of all these transition projects, energy infrastructure type projects all over the region. I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit around any trends that you are seeing in terms of the kind of projects that are coming online. What have we learned? I mean, like from a financing point of view to get this transition going.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Actually, we've been looking as a bank at coal MPO, managed phase out, under the ADB ETM scheme for slightly over 3 years. We were advising INA, which is one of the sovereign wealth funds of Indonesia, to close down a coal-fired power plant in Cirebon. And we are also an active member of Traction, which is this transition coalition, transition credits coalition convened by the MAS. So a lot of learnings over the years. What we've discovered, quite evident to us, is just lowering the cost of capital to effectuate this is probably not enough, right? Which was the original thesis. Bringing in philanthropic capital, blend capital, lower returns, and close it down early. So that's not enough. So we were really very excited when we said that this is going to be paired with transition credits because we think that is key to unlocking private sector capital, right? To give that momentum to do this within that time frame for developing markets, at least within 2040. So as an institution, we have indeed been doing that compare and contrast, right, internally. That how do we compare and contrast this to bankable projects that we have done, right? Solar, wind, etc. And underpinning, I mean, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence because it's a very smart room, but underpinning bankability for most of these projects really is three things, right? Accurate risk identification, effective risk allocation to credible counterparties, and then pricing it right. You get these things right, you get a deal banked, right? So if we do a typical power plant that I think most of us are familiar with, solar or wind or conventional, usually we bank a project through construction to operations. So that period where you fund and you don't get cash flow is not new to the market, right? This timing mismatch that people talk, it's not new. It's just the length that's new, right? So construction periods, we fund it through. How do we identify risks around construction? Is mature technologies, reputable equipment suppliers, EPC contractors who are reputable, balance sheet, performance bonds, yada, yada. The room knows this. Most of you know this. So that's done. That's done in the market. Then operations, obviously, strong off-taker, that's a given. Fixed price, stability of cash flows, that's also a given, right? Market is familiar. Operations, for a solar plant or wind plant, interestingly, over the years, after conventional, the market has had to deal with and get familiar with all these baselining or projections of sun resource and wind resource. We didn't have to do that sort of when it was coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants. There's a lot more certainty around it. So the market, again, is also ready with these P90, P50, P75 projections around resources. So that's during the operations piece. Strong off-taker, comfort around wind resources by reputable assessors, and then, of course, getting a good operator, right? But then overarching all this would be acts of God, natural catastrophes, commercial insurance, still there, right? We can back it off to them. And then for some markets, political force majeure, right? Where maybe sometimes the governments frustrate through either commission or omission of acts to frustrate the project. So that one, political force majeure, mostly in Asia, we've seen that backed off with multilaterals and export credit agencies. So broadly, that's how we map it and draw the similarities. Now, then we ask ourselves, a co-MPO, right, a managed phase-out, can we fit that and structure that within the frame? I believe the answer is a yes. The similarities I would draw out, but there are also contrasts, right? I don't want to be irrationally exuberant. The gestation period between funding the takeover of a coal asset to the printing of these transition credits, that we can technically call the construction period, right, that we're familiar with, right? It's just that the contrast is these periods are longer than usual, right? There could be a decade. Now, with the passage of time, obviously, uncertainty and volatility increases, right? The perception of risk increases. It's not unsolvable. We think it's solvable. There are a few ways to skin the cat. We can stagger cash flows. We can either stagger cash flows through staggered disbursements, or we can hopefully accelerate some early generation of transition credits, right? Or we could defer the payment of deferred payment schemes for some of these acquisitions. So I think it's solvable, right? Industry needs to think around that. Then the mind-bending thing, at least for me, is that all my life I've been funding projects to get them to operate, right? So this is probably the first time where we finance a project to keep it from operating, because you get paid when it doesn't operate. So that's the mind-bending thing. So when you get over that mental hang-up, actually you can get across that and see that. Then how do we get the transition credits to be printed, right? So instead of commissioning now, we have decommissioning, right? We've got to make sure the plant is decommissioned. So there's a technical realm to that, which I think the industry can take on, right? But there's also a governmental regulatory risk around that, because after the passage of 10 years, if the governments change their mind and do not allow the shutdown of the coal plant, then we're in trouble. I think that we can again back off to multilaterals or export credit agencies, because that's political force majeure, which the market has dealt with before, right, in another form. So that's the justice. Then the printing part, when the transition credits come out, now Eric and I, and most of you would know, when we commission a plant and the turbines start to turn and the solar panels start to generate, a meter will tell us the electrons have passed and everybody starts paying. That's easy, right? In transition credits, there's no meter. There are these, as I'm learning every day, there are these things called VVBs, not these things, these institutions, right? VVBs, validation and verification bodies, right? So the methodology for coming up with a product called transition credit is a design methodology that is validated and then verified. And when that gets printed, we get our money from the off-taker who's buying this, right? A credible off-taker is hygiene. I won't talk too much about that. But the printing of that, I think the industry needs to get comfortable that this is the validation. The methodology probably needs to be, in short, it is baseline emissions minus leakage minus project emissions, right? So leakage, we can take care of through possibly multilateral ECA political risk coverage. Project emissions, the project should take care of it. Now, the thing that we are still kind of working through is this baseline emissions. Again, baseline emissions, be conservative about it. That we sort of have done in wind and solar resource. We have P90s, so that's one. The only thing that we are a little bit more concerned about is there's also a talk about the frequency of reviewing these baselines. So I think the industry needs to be comfortable that it needs to be a conservative baseline such that when there's these regulatory resets, these resets of baselines, right? Again, regulatory resets are not uncommon in financing, but when these baselines come, there is enough data for us like sun resource and wind resource for the industry to get comfortable that, hey, that projection around even when baselines come in this way, that's that. Of course, the ideal for me as a financier is that when the baseline is fixed for the next 10 years, right? But if every 2 years or 6 years it gets revised, then I think we need to get comfortable because the lower your baseline, of course, the higher the price of your transition credit.
Though I must
right?
say,
So that's
I must say that on the issue around dynamic baselining, which is a topic that we are frequently confronted with when we're looking at carbon projects, that is a problem that is perhaps a little bit more salient when we're looking at nature-based projects. Because especially when you're looking at counterfactuals and you're talking about biological assets, it's a little bit more difficult to actually be well granular in the predictive aspect, right, around the forward forecasting of the emissions that were avoided. Whereas for a coal plant, you have actually 10, 15 years of operating experience. You have many other coal plants of a similar type, where you can reasonably assume at a given level of utilization and particular operating conditions, how much emissions you have actually saved in that sense, right?
Correct,
so
correct.
The risks are not quite the same.
So you're right, it's just that I think the power mix and the advent of advanced technologies and all that could change that projection. So that's why we wanted to.
Correct.
You're right, it's safer than nature-based, but that's the thing that we're still working on.
But actually, I wanted to probe a little bit further, and I want to draw Eric in to perhaps explain, when we think about the users of funds, right? Why are transition credit revenues actually important? Because when we think about a coal phase-out project, what are the elements of that project at high level, right, that we kind of like need to fund through a combination of the revenues from transition credits, the combination of the revenues from the future PPAs on the renewables that are meant to replace it and so on and so forth, or the just transition? Maybe you can just step us through, when we get the cash in, what are we spending the cash on?
I'll give a high-level overview now, Fred. I think there's a panel later on. I have a one page to show the details, but just to keep the audience from suspense, let me just address it briefly. I think broadly speaking, the way we think about it is there's the just transition piece, and then there is the clean energy replacement piece, right? So if we do this coal to clean transition, we shut down a coal plant. The principle behind that is, number one, we should keep all stakeholders whole. And by stakeholders, we mean the investors, the owners of the coal plant, the lenders, the workers, the communities, the customers, right? So we need to keep them whole. We need to ensure that no one gets left behind. Remember, we are basically we have to replace the foregone cash flows, right? We cannot, those investors don't run a charity, so we need to keep them whole. And we have to ensure that no one gets left behind. So hence, taking care of the workers and communities. And then the proper decommissioning and asset repurposing as well. So that's the just transition piece. Somebody has to foot that bill. So that is the use of proceeds, bucket one, if you will, of the transition credits. The second bucket is the clean energy replacement. Now, in certain markets, perhaps you don't need, people normally say in the video, solar is already cheaper than coal. It is true when the sun is shining, but at night, so it's apples and oranges comparison. We need to make it apples to apples. And also, without going to the gory details, replacing a coal plant output really requires a large-scale renewable energy plant. And believe it or not, when I say to people that a larger plant, solar and battery storage, by the way, is required because we don't believe in the context of the Philippines that it is just to just replace a coal plant, which is steady, reliable baseload, with an intermittent solar farm that doesn't produce any power at night. It is not just. So we need to take that into consideration. But that aside, and that adds cost, that aside, the notion of scale, we are all trained in our economics class that with scale, there's economies of scale. It has to be cheaper once you go bigger. Well, to a certain extent, yes, but unfortunately, the size of our plants that are required to replace a coal plant, we are not at a scale that makes it really cheaper. So for example, if we go very small, like a 50 megawatt solar plant, that is very cheap because the infrastructure required there is almost zero, right? The connection to the grid is very zero. But once you go to 500, 1,000 megawatts, which is probably the order of magnitude we need to replace a 246 megawatt coal plant, you'll need probably 1,500 megawatts of solar, more or less. You are in a neither here nor there zone. You need to invest a lot in infrastructure, civil infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, because you cannot have a big land, 1,500 hectares, near the grid and near the population. And we need to avoid competing against food or agriculture, and we need to avoid heavily forested areas.
Yep.
So basically, we need to be far, and that requires a lot of infrastructure. It's gonna be cheaper now if we get to the 4, 5, 6,000 megawatts, but that's too big to replace a 240 megawatts. So that's that's why this project still needs a subsidy. We'll show the numbers later on, but unfortunately, there is a value gap. We don't want the price of electricity to go higher because we're replacing a relatively cheap source, which is coal, with a more expensive, firm, reliable, renewable energy output.
Yeah. I think what is interesting from the comments that Eric has made, and I think it's something that we will deep dive later when we talk about the finance track, is really exactly when cash is needed. Because the question around typical project financing, right? The first time that you actually need a lot of cash for a project like that is when you need to decide to construct the renewable replacement in anticipation of the shutdown of the coal plant. And then the next big use of cash is when you actually need to buy over the coal plant in order to shut it down. So it may or may not always be the case about the long duration of the cash out without certainty of the cash in. So that is the part that I think if we can, we should deep dive later when Ganesh is leading us through the work stream on financing later. Now, one of the other things that WeSing has touched on is about methodological rigor and uncertainty, right? Because we are all interested when we're buying carbon credits to make sure that it is actually credible, it's high integrity. So if I could turn to Ravi a little bit and just get his perspectives on, get your perspectives, Ravi, on what do you think in your mind would make transition credits a high quality, high integrity carbon credits that sovereigns would be prepared to step in and say, yep, I'm going to back the demand signal for something like that?
Yeah, and that indeed is the one of the more difficult aspects of this whole exercise. We are now, to be candid about it, operating in an environment where confidence in carbon markets is weak. prices have fallen, transaction volumes have come down. Over the last few years, some of the excitement and hope about carbon markets and carbon credits has diminished drastically. For good reasons, or maybe not so good reasons, but a germ of truth in some of these reasons, which is that there have been several abuses of how carbon credits were generated. The proclaimed reduction in greenhouse gas emissions did not occur. There were problems with verification. And on the buyer side, some corporates were looking for very cheap credits to meet carbon targets when they have not themselves exhausted their decarbonization potential. Now, we need to fix all this, and the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a lot of effort internationally. Many parties coming together to say, look, this is a problem we need to fix, because without carbon markets, we're not going to get the private financing necessary for the net zero transition. For transition credits, a particular class of carbon credits, there is the added challenge of persuading people and buyers that this is legit. There is a tendency, unfortunately, in many parts of the world to look at anything that has to do with coal with a great deal of odium, to keep away from it. And I think that's being a little short-sighted for the reasons I suggested, because if you leave it alone, it's not going to go away. It's going to come back to haunt us in climate change. So I think at the same time, when those of us who are working on these coal phase-out projects need to be very mindful that ultimately the credits we generate must have a market, which means we must listen closely to what the demand side is saying. They want high integrity credits. And that means environmental integrity. One, additionality. Credits are all about additionality. If this is a coal plant that's going to be shut down anyway in 5 years' time, it's not making much money, it's not adding much to the grid, right? You've fully recouped your capex. You can't really generate credits from those. I mean, plants like these are being shut down routinely in Europe and including in America, because you've recouped everything and it's easier to just install the solar plant. So additionality is important. And the interesting thing about additionality is the baseline, because you need to determine what is the greenhouse gas emissions you are reducing that would otherwise not have happened if not for the credits. If it was going to happen anyway, you cannot get credits for it. So demonstrating additionality is central. And in the methodology that was worked out, the Rockefeller Foundation and others, that is a key point, to demonstrate additionality. Second, no leakage. You cannot have carbon leakage through the grid. So, and again, we've seen abuses of this in the past. Somebody shuts down a coal plant, tries to get credits, another coal plant springs up on the same grid few miles away. Same operator, same entity. Now this is cheating the system. You're not reducing emissions, you're not saving the planet, you're just making money through an arbitrage. So no leakage is an important principle. There must be permanence in the reduction of the CO2, which means a fair amount of replacement renewable capacity needs to be installed, because otherwise how are people going to get their electricity? Another important dimension is all this needs to be done in the context of robust national energy plans. There must be a national energy transition plan that gives credence, because what you're doing is you are taking over a coal plant, putting money in it for its early decommissioning. You need to be assured that this is occurring in the context of a national transition away from coal and fossil fuels towards renewables. That is an important thing that buyers of credits are looking for. And so we need to also meet that. And one of the good things of the Philippines is that Philippines has the makings of a good national transition energy plan. And we need to build on that and persuade buyers that there is such a plan. I'll mention one other thing that is quite key to making this whole thing work, and that is the reliability of the renewable energy you're using to replace. And we've already touched on it. If there is no grid connectivity, I think the credibility of the whole enterprise comes into question. If you don't have transmission lines to bring renewable energy to the site, I think you have a problem. And so I think we need to address grid connectivity. And in the Philippines, that will be an important area of focus, that if you don't have the grid connectivity, then it's quite moot, as Eric reminded us, that the solar energy is cheaper than the coal energy, because you can't get it to where it's needed. It's not going to work.
Exactly.
No, thanks for that. And I think that is quite a good scene setter for the methodology work stream or workshop later that we are going to be, or the track that we're going to be talking about methodology, and to understand the different aspects of where the methodologies are going, because it's not just one methodology today that's in play, but there are several, but then only one that has been approved by a standard body. And so we can understand the different elements of what makes a transition credit a high quality transition credit. But we have touched on a little bit around also what the demand side will be looking for, and that's where Nat's stream later will talk about. But I think I want to end off this part of the segment also by discussing something else, and that is the fact that, you know, the transition credits are going to represent a very big part of the revenue. And we're saying, you know, when we are lending money, we got to worry about where the cash flows are going to come back in order to pay us back. In your opinion, I mean, are transition credits securitizable? I mean, like, can you take that as the revenues from these transition credits as something that you can bank?
I think whether something is securitizable, it's okay. Securitization is to me, different sides of the same coin around a long commitment to payment for giving of value to a long cash flow stream. That's basically it, right? How you cut it, either you do it through a prepayment, you do it through securitization, etc. So to me, it's still fundamental to what the points that Ravi raised. That the moment we can start creating that credibility, right? When there's that credibility behind the value of that, that's probably how it starts. And we have gone through the energy transition. There was a time, I think most of us remember, where we were very wary even of financing solar plants, right? And that's, I believe transition credits would have to go through that same process. And that's why I think if you want to scale this thing, let's get through a credible pilot, possibly with reputable players. I think that's the way to demonstrate it, because that's how I've seen other technologies, and this in a sense, I put in the category of technologies, take off. Because the market must also know there is a return on effort, you know. Meaning because there will be a lot of effort, there will be a whole ecosystem, a new ecosystem of players who would be validating this product. And the market must recognize that there is a deep pipeline for them to spend that effort. So just speaking very commercially from there, I think securitizable, creating value on that's fundamental. And I think we really need to prove it through a pilot that we hopefully can do soon. And I'm quite heartened that 2030 closure actually is just less than, it's about 5 years away. So that even that period is much shorter than the ones that we've been talking about. So that ticks a few boxes, and I suppose that's why we're all gathered here to try to give momentum to this thing, right?
Excellent. Now, as we conclude this panel, I want to touch on the final topic that I raised at the start, and that is about remembering that all our projects will affect communities. It's not just an environment game, it isn't just a question around the finances, but also about the communities that we will impact. So maybe this is more a question for Eric. As you are thinking about the plant in South Luzon, how is the team actually thinking about the just transition aspect of this transition? What makes it just?
Yes, this is quite central to us. In fact, as far back as when we did the stage one, which is the ETM, when one of the critical success factors of the ETM was to get stakeholder commitment. It started with that. And by stakeholder, we don't only mean Ayala Corporation being the ultimate majority owner, but equally, if not more importantly, the people working in the plant, right? As well as the broader community. So we did engage with them. We both on a group level, town hall type, and individual level. And in the visit tomorrow, you will see that the management team of the coal plant is also very much in line, in tune, in lockstep with us on this journey. Now, having said that, on the broader, on a deeper level, we're very careful about the timing of engagement across the different individuals who will be impacted, and I'll explain why. First of all, the ETM is a 2040 timeline. No one really cares about what will happen in 15 to, at that time, 17 years time. Said, okay, noted, good one, but I won't be working here in 17 years' time. So but having said that, we had to engage with them because fake news can spread easily, right? So now with transition credits, that timeline is closer. It's 2030, it's no joke, right? So now we have to be very sensitive. Now, we want to make sure that we make the proper balance between engaging them, but not to the point that we make people anxious, right? So timing is very critical. We want to somewhat de-risk this in the progress that we understand is already happening between the G2G. Some of the key players are here in this room between Philippines and Singapore. Once we see that really happening, and once we see the offtake getting real, then that would be the best time to engage more meaningfully with each stakeholder. But definitely the principles that we are following is, number one, these just transition plans will be individualized at the plant level. It will boil down to each individual, right? There are only 200 plus employees. It will be individual. What is customizable to each individual? Number two, we're already starting, but in an organic fashion. The good thing about this is there's still a linkage between ASEN and SLTech. We still have oversight on operations and maintenance, so we can take their people, not all of them, but one by one. I think we've already rotated around 5 or 6 people, and we reassign them to our renewable energy plants around the country. So there's proof of concept that these skills are transferable. We are already effectively starting the transition. On the community side, again, this is the first, among the first in the world, and we need to get the best practices and so forth. So for example, SLTech is the second largest taxpayer in the local community, in the local government. We don't want to leave a hole. Now, there will be the asset repurposing. So in asset repurposing, we're going to think of all the stakeholders in terms of our decision making. It's not only what's best for the investor, but also what's best across the different stakeholders, including community and the workers and so forth. So it's a balance, I guess. It's a work in progress, but also we're thinking of the sinking fund, for example, to plug any gaps that may be left behind the second largest revenue earner for the local government and the replacement business or industrial activity. So thinking about financial mechanisms to plug the gap funded by transition credits, I think, is also the way to go. So a lot of nuances, but this is to give you a flavor of how we're thinking about making the transition truly just.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think we have covered through this opening panel quite a lot of topics. First of all, around the case of why it's important to tackle this issue around coal transition, why transition credits are an important part of being able to accelerate the managed phase-out of coal plants, what are some of the difficulties and challenges and lessons learned from financing such transition projects in Asia, and what are some of the difficulties that might be associated with it. We talked a little bit about the importance of integrity and methodological rigor when it comes to the transition credits. And finally, we also touched on a little bit around the importance of thinking through a just transition. Now, the way that we have organized today's proceedings, right, for the afternoon is as follows. With this scene setter of an opening panel, we are curating 3 very, very deep dives later on after the break. The first one actually will touch on some of the methodological developments and methodological issues. I would encourage you, as Anshari is leading through that process, for many of us who are in the room who have questions around the integrity of transition credits, concerns around what does it mean to actually work on coal plants and so on and so forth, to ask as many questions as you like and to get comfortable with the way that we are approaching these methodologies. And more importantly, to also have a proper scan of the different methodological approaches that are out there and why we are betting down on some of these approaches. The second track actually looks at the issue of financing a little bit more deeply, because this question around financing is actually not trivial. I think the more that you study this, the more you know how little we have actually touched the surface. So it is important to then think about how do we finance this thing properly? What is the proper role of transition credits? Where is the money going to? The timings and all that kind of thing. And why does that matter? Because at the end of the day, the financing will make this type of project sustainable, right? We are of course doing a pilot right now, But we want the learnings from this pilot, the model from this pilot, to actually be scalable and to actually carry on with more projects, not just in the Philippines, but also in the rest of Asia, which is what Ravi was saying, right? And finally, we also have a deep dive track on the demand side, which is what NET will lead us on. Because some of us in the room, beyond just the governments and the financiers and the investors and the project operators, are also potential buyers of these credits. What should you be looking for? What would give you confidence to be able to invest in and to purchase these credits and to give the kind of advanced market commitments? Now, if you think about all of these things, we can solve the methodology, we can solve the financing, we can solve the operational side. But if no one is prepared to buy the transition credits, we can't start. And therefore, it is very important to have that dialogue now with our buyer communities to understand what would you need to see, what do you need to believe, what would you need to feel comfortable in order to be able to give that demand signal so that we, the rest of us involved in the projects, can carry on with our work. So with that, please join me in thanking the panelists, Ravi, Eric, and Wee Sing, for a wonderful opening session. Thank you.
Thank you to all panelists and our moderator Fred for the insightful panel session and underscoring the importance of having credible transition credits and a just transition plan. Before we move on to our next segment of deep dives discussion around methodologies, financing and catalyzing demand, we will take a short 15-minute intermission break. We have prepared a selection of local Filipino delights for tea, which will now be served outside our ballroom entrance. We look forward to inviting you back to the ballroom at 3:30 p.m. sharp, where we will kick off our deep dives with a session of methodology anchored by Anshari Rahman, Policy and Analytics Director at GenZero. We will see everyone back soon. Dear guests, please be seated soon as the event will resume promptly at 3:30 p.m. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Kindly settle down and please take your seats. In the first half of our GenZero Climate Summit Insights today, our panelists highlighted the need to ensure integrity and methodological rigor for transition credits to scale. Anshari Rahman, Head of Policy and Analytics at GenZero, will now kick off the afternoon of discussions with a segment providing a deep dive into methodologies and how they can address environmental and social issues while enabling projects to have climate impact at scale. We remind the audience that the deep dive session today will be conducted under the Chatham House rule, so we encourage you to take this opportunity to share your insights and perspectives on this topic with everyone else in the room. Over to you, Anshari.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back from your break. I hope you've got a good framing from the panel discussion earlier and you're ready to go into a deep dive. I wouldn't say it's exactly a deep dive because the new methodology is like 60 pages long with 2 other modules around additionality, another 60 pages long. But what I've done is try to distill what are the developments in the carbon markets and also what are the available methodologies today to underpin what constitutes a credible credit coming out from this new asset class called transition credits. So let's step back and see how the market has evolved. The market is actually not new. It's been around since the early 2000s. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there's a clean development mechanism, and it's gone through ups and downs. And in the early 2010s, there's the voluntary and independent carbon standards, largely seen to be a lot more innovative to serve a voluntary carbon market for corporates, but also a lot faster than the central mechanism under the UNFCCC. Come 2021, 2022, a lot of blowback from the media around overcrediting, around the quality of supply, and today we are seeing the emergence of new governance and meta standards such as ICVCM, VCMI, ISO, SBTI to provide a bit more assurance and confidence into the credibility on both the demand and supply side. And coming back full circle, governments are also coming into weigh in. Right? We've seen guidance from various jurisdictions around how corporates can credibly use carbon credits. Right? We are not going to touch on the semantics of whether you can offset, whether you can contribute, whether you can compensate or address. Right? But let's go straight into the credibility of supply today. I would say that there are various levels that we look at in terms of quality of supply. Right, the first one is the emergence of meta standards, or what is seen to be good enough in the market. Right, and today, on the supply side, we see largely 2 bodies. One is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, ICVCM in short. Potentially, they might move to a voluntary carbon market angle to a more verified carbon market, given the convergence between voluntary and compliance. The other one is CORSIA, which is under ICAO. So what essentially these bodies do, generally speaking, is to assess the veracity of governance of some of these independent standards, as well as the methodologies underlying these standards. Right? So under the standards section, you've got your VERA, your gold standard, your ACR, UNFCCC 6.4 is actually a standard, all with methodologies across different project types and interventions. Right? So these guys, ICVCM and CORSIA, they will assess whether these methodologies are good enough. But at the project level, you can have a project in Mindanao, a project in South Luzon, a project in Paraguay, right? Using the same methodology. At the project level, they can be of different quality. And that's where ratings firms such as Silvera, B0, Calix, and others do assess the quality of individual projects. So across the entire stack, you actually today are seeing, and you can observe, that there's stronger assurances in governance, right? Because of the pressures, the independent standards are also updating their methodologies, and they are releasing new ones. So transition credits is a new asset class in the market today, and VERA is not the only one, right? There are others in various stages of development, but the only one that's online today and operational is VERA that they launched in May, also back in Singapore, right? It's VM52 but it's not VM52 standalone. There are other additional modules around additionality, baselines, and just transition. Right? And I'm going to touch on just transition, but bear in mind, just transition, I think, and I stand corrected from my Vera colleagues and ICVCM colleagues, just transition from a social community perspective, it has always been a core benefit previously in the standards. Today, under transition credits methodology, just transition is very much a centerpiece of this whole piece, right? So the equitable benefit sharing to local communities is very much integral to the success of the methodology itself. Now you would see in the second column there's project-based and jurisdictional-based. The ones in green are project-based, and the ones in blue is jurisdictional. What that means is essentially you have to be prepared for a future where project-based facility decarbonization, decommissioning should be nested or be part of a broader sectoral grid-level decarbonization. And that's when the policy and regulatory frameworks are ready, right? And there are work ongoing. C2S Kinetic Coalition is leading the charge around a jurisdictional approach. And we look forward to when that approach and methodology will be released, because I think that's a key barometer on how we look at beyond the crediting period, how can this actually address a lot of the issues around leakage or even permanence. Now, there are many different aspects, and we wouldn't go into the weeds of every single provision in the methodology, but I would highlight probably 5 different areas which would be quite key to transition credits as an asset class. Right, the first one is essentially what will be eligible. All coal plants can decommission, can use this methodology? Not really, right? The second one, additionality and baseline setting. How do we ensure that the credits that are generated are real and represent real abatement that can be credibly used by corporates and sovereigns? Third one is leakage. This is the one that I was speaking about earlier. When you look at project level, how does it nest within a jurisdictional approach, right? The fourth one is permanence and how you ensure that the reductions or abatement are actually lasting. And the last one, again, just transition. How do you prioritize social responsibility? Right, what qualifies under the new Vera methodology VM42? Not all coal plants, actually only coal plants that are set up before 2022, and they are grid connected, right? Because the grid connection is important to look at the baselines and also address leakage. It has to demonstrate ongoing commercial operations, right? It must not have a mandate enclosure in place already, and it must have an operating lifetime of at least 5 years. There must be renewable energy replacement, and there is a whole list of what qualifies as renewable energy. And it specifies minimum renewable energy replacement of at least 40%. I would note that I believe for ASEN, we are going for 100%. Right? So it's going above and beyond what the methodology requires. So this is also a philosophy that GenZero as an investment firm takes, which is to what extent can we go above and beyond what the methodology requires and do what's necessary, particularly for first of a kind. And then it's not just at the project facility level, but also at the host country level. You need to have an NDC, you need to have a power plan, right? And Philippines does have that, right? And also you need to ensure that there's no new coal that's going to be generated. And Philippines does have a moratorium on greenfield coal. ASEAN is also not building any more new coal plants, right? So those are some of the criteria set under VM52. How I frame these criteria is essentially some of the common questions that we face when we engage with various stakeholders, whether it's governments, whether it's prospective buyers, and also NGOs in the space. Right? On additionality and baseline, this is important. How confident are we that the credits represent real abatement? Right? So there are various aspects on additionality tests, namely regulatory surplus, the financial additionality, assessing the investment barriers. It must not be cheap to do so today. And Eric has explained at length at the earlier panel that in reality it is not, right? And also common practice, that this is almost not a common practice within this region. So these are some of the, it's not new. This is very much part of the protocols for various standards already. Now in terms of the baseline setting, again, what this methodology has done is to take a very conservative approach, which is what is the earliest of the 5 scenarios that you see on the screen today. Right? And that takes on a fairly conservative approach. Now, bear this in mind, because the conservative approach to baseline setting does affect the volumes of credits that are issued. Right? It provides a bit more assurance, but it also means there's actually reductions that do not translate into volumes of credits that are issued. Now, these can actually benefit the host country. And I'll explain more in my concluding slide. Another common question is around leakage. Will emissions simply shift to another source, right? And under this methodology, they have safeguards, right? There are additional safeguards that you can look at beyond what the methodology requires, but essentially renewable energy pairing and also grid considerations, accounting for the potential for other power plants to compensate for the lost electricity generation. Right. I want to also highlight another consideration, which is a potential for nesting within jurisdictional approaches. To put it simply, there is a parallel in a forest conservation project type, which is REDD+. For those who are familiar, project-based REDD+, today, there is a general sense that it has to move towards a jurisdictional approach. And that's possibly around the theory of change largely for energy transition. How do you start with a project base, not to discount the validity and the veracity of projects or individual facilities and plants that are being decommissioned, but in future moving towards a more sectoral or policy-based approach. Now, the other question that we always get asked is, how do you ensure that the environmental benefits or the abatement is lasting, which is the issue around permanence, right? And this is really about no new commitments to coal, right? And that provides a lot of assurance, and that is not easy, both at the company level, but also at the country level, right? That there is not going to be any reversals, right, or even leakage for this new coal. And finally, I would state for just transition, it's a very long list of requirements. I'm just flagging some of the highlights from these methodologies. So you need to have a just transition plan, and you need to engage stakeholders early. Eric has already outlined what is probably appropriate timing, right? For the ASEM plant itself, the target decommissioning year is 2030. So there is still time, and we need the advanced market commitment for us to kickstart the engagement process, if I understand Eric correctly. Right. You need to also have mitigation plans for the livelihoods, jobs, and all the ancillary services around the facility that will be affected by the coal decommissioning. And in terms of the periodic review, there needs to be third-party auditing. In fact, I've also heard in various forums and roundtables that it is advisable to engage third-party actors, whether it's NGOs or trade unions, to actually be part of the entire engagement plan itself, right from the onset. Right, and I think there are various NGOs that are leaning in today, and we should leverage this opportunity for this pilot and others. I'm going to move on to accounting, and we spoke about how we need to ensure just transition and benefits to the local communities, local livelihoods. But what about the host country, right? And here I have to say I come from an Article 6 world in my past life. And there is this perception that corresponding adjustments in Article 6 is actually detrimental to the host country's ability to meet its NDC. I will debunk that, right? I would say no, it's not, right? But there are assumptions, and I will use this as a case study, right? Assuming a country, is not just Philippines, any host country, has submitted an unconditional NDC that it promises to deliver X amount of abatement by year 2030 through its policies and measures. And in year 2030, it actually delivers this abatement, and the abatement that it promised is realized under its unconditional NDC. Everything else is an overachievement, right? So what corresponding adjustment is a correction for the reductions that are transferred to another international compliance obligation, such that it is not double counted by two countries or towards a host country and another international compliance used like CORSIA. Okay, so put that in mind because we are going to go into the corporate side, VCM side, which actually I would argue doesn't require corresponding adjustment. Right, so in the case of SL Tech, let's assume that it generates today about 1.8 million tons per annum of emissions. And through the conservative baseline in VM52, you actually credit only 1.6, right? There is 0.2 MT worth that is not credited, but actually represent abatement that occurred, right? This is abatement that the host country will count towards its NDC, right? And the credits that are issued with LOA and corresponding adjusted for only corrects for the 1.6 that is transferred internationally. But whatever that Philippines or any other host country government promises under its unconditional NDC would have been met. I would say that it assumes that the host country will deliver and all the abatement under its policies and measures are realized by the target year, right? And that is the concept behind corresponding adjustments. Now, there are also other benefits from Article 6. Beyond the crediting period, you will actually see abatement that would translate into the next and future NDCs. So there are longer tail end benefits for the host country that they should consider, particularly when looking at designing policies around carbon markets. And not to mention, we spoke about just transition, there are also other co-benefits and ways where host countries can look at to leverage share of proceeds from Article 6 and the revenue to be channeled to other mitigation or adaptation measures. Right? So there could be other forms. And we've seen this exercise in many other countries. As investors, we would want a balanced approach in terms of what is the fee that's introduced, but we do see it's important to ensure that we see the revenues benefit both the host country, but also the local communities. Now, this brings me to my last point around counting, which is the voluntary carbon market when corporates are using carbon credits towards their Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, or towards their interim voluntary targets, where they are not exposed to any compliance schemes, they do not require corresponding adjustments. Right? This is the genesis behind Article 6 when we talk about contributions claims. Right? Because corporates, when they use carbon credits towards their own voluntary corporate targets, are contributing towards the host country's own NDC achievement. Right? Of course, when you look at the Article 6 text itself, because it represents consensus, you will not get an explicit mention, and I apologize for that. Right? But this is the genesis why, conceptually, corporates, when they are using towards their corporate voluntary targets, you actually do not need corresponding adjustments. And this is a way that Philippines government or the host country can actually utilize both Article 6 and voluntary carbon markets in a way that crowds in investments from both capital markets, private sector markets, but also demand from international compliance market towards projects in its country. So let's say in the case of SL Tech or the ASM pilot here, you've got 1.8 million tons of emissions, again from the previous example. If you are only authorizing for a portion of that, right? And there is a common term that host countries will want to ring fence certain volumes for its own domestic use or for its own NDC. What does this mean? Right? You can actually use the voluntary carbon market, avail these credits for the voluntary carbon market, where the underlying abatement actually benefits your own NDC. Because what corporates use towards their corporate voluntary targets also contributes towards your own host country achievement. Probably confused everyone. So I welcome any comments, questions, but I will also invite friends from South Pole, Frederick, who's here, and South Pole was part of the team at CCI who developed the methodology, and also Win from Vera, to maybe share some thoughts around the methodology itself and your journey in terms of this transition credit space and where the methodology sits today. I will end, before I hand over to Frederick or Win, that there are several steps that we're also looking at. So if you recall in my earlier slide, we have meta standards, ICVCM and CORSIA. This is something that we as investors are also looking at. It's not the end of the journey here. So Vera has released a methodology, but we would want to only look into this project once we have secured CCP label, because that is the benchmark quality that buyers today are looking at. So the methodology itself, VM52, needs to clear ICVCM. And ICVCM has a continuous improvement working group to look at various aspects of energy transition. CORSIA is the other one for potential compliance use. But for CORSIA, if you recall, as I mentioned, for RED+, there is a decision around only allowing jurisdictional approach. So we have to see how the decisions pan out at CORSIA, but either CORSIA or ICVCM label are key meta standard indicators that we look at as investors for these credits to be seen to be viable and credible in the market today. I'll end there, and maybe I'll invite Frederick, if you want to say something.
Sure, thank you very much, Anshari. I'm Frederick Lebrun, Global Policy Director at South Pole. South Pole is a carbon project developer and consultant, and we were indeed part of the team that developed the methodology from the Coal to Clean Credit initiative funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And we collaborated with civil society organizations as well, CPI and RMI in particular, to socialize the work as we were developing the methodology. And I must say it took 3 years, essentially. It was a 3-year journey to get this methodology to be adopted finally by a standard, Vera, with whom we worked very closely. And the methodology has gone through several rounds of consultations in countries, for example, in Asia, where the coal is particularly challenging, in Indonesia and Vietnam, for example, and also global consultations that are baked into the process for a standard like Vera to adopt the methodology. So there's been 2 rounds of consultations, public consultations, and then a third-party auditing of the methodology before Vera gave its stamp of approval and allowed the utilization of the methodology to generate credits. So it's quite an achievement, and it really was a major team effort involving many organizations, and I can say it's gone through a lot of scrutiny. The other aspect that I would like to highlight, and you touched on it, Anshari, is the fact that for the very first time, the just transition aspect, the social aspects of decommissioning a coal plant and the related impacts on workers and communities that we heard about earlier, is fully baked into the methodology. It is not just a co-benefit that we can measure and talk about. It is actually something that is on equal footing with the carbon reductions, in the sense that there's an obligation and a requirement for the project proponent to develop a just transition plan. 2% of the transition credit revenue are meant to be earmarked to the implementation of that plan, and the implementation of the plan is meant to be monitored and third-party audited, just like the emission reductions, by a third-party auditor on a yearly basis. So it is quite innovative, and we're quite pleased with the fact that Vera embraced this innovation in the market to make sure that the social aspects were properly dealt with. Happy to take any questions as well.
Thank you, Frederick. Win, anything to add? Oh, behind.
Thank you. Winston here from Vera. So I have good news and bad news. So I'll probably start with good news first. Now, we have submitted the applications to the ICVCM for the assessment of BM52, assessment for the alignment with core carbon principles. So that's the good news. Now, the bad news is the assessments, it will be an internal assessment, but the progress has yet to commence. So last time we checked, it is a long queue. So no good news on that front yet. We are watching closely on the ICVCM website. That's also where you can publicly, transparently check the progress. So good news and bad news there. On CORSIA, our understanding is all VCUs are eligible unless it's specifically mentioned by AKO for exclusions. So right now, should be eligible to receive Article 6, CORSIA for phase number 1 eligibility. On the nesting and jurisdictional approach, ICAO has not mentioned that as a requirement for eligibility for transition credits. Also, just to share, next year, we will start looking more closely into exploring and potentially developing a jurisdictional approach for transition credits. And this is something that we have we have the jurisdictional nested red frameworks already there. We can draw examples and then use that to develop the frameworks. But alternatively, we can make updates to the program, the methodologies, so that it can become nested under other jurisdictional programs. So there are potential pathway for this to move forward to the jurisdictional approach. On the methodology side, just a quick comment. I just have to share this burning comments is because people think RED projects are complicated enough. Wait until you look at those 60 pages of methodologies. There are 3 components, and each component is challenging. I think Ansari has spared you the pain, but I'll give you a few examples. The decommissioning of the coal-fired plants, you can dismantle the equipment, but you cannot sell those equipment off to another plant operators. That's one of the requirements. You can scrap it, but you can't sell it off to another operators. That's how strict it is. On the pairing, the minimum requirement is 10%. By end of the project crediting period, must be 40%. If the country renegades, say that 5 years down the line, I'm going to build more coal-fired plant, that's the end of the project. You can't earn any more credits. That is very strict. So that's something you can refer in the methodology. On just transitions, I don't even get started. If the workers are close to retirement, they get compensations, good package. If the workers still have a long employment period, potentially, you can't just pay them off and then bye-bye. You have to provide them some alternative. That is not easy compared to the usual corporates. I'm closing down business, that's it. Nothing else I'm providing. Very different. So to me, it's more of a community project to begin with than to just put it simply as a tech-based project or to categorize it as an energy projects. Very challenging. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Maybe I can conclude by saying it's not easy to do this methodology. It's not easy to do a transition project, but it should not be impossible, right? Okay, I'll open the floor to any questions, comments, or queries. Thank you.
So my name is Mizu Fujie from Mizuho Bank, and thank you for having us because we are very keen to support transition credit project from financing perspective. So recalling the Secretary Lotila's opening remark, I understand that the Philippine government is moving forward to creating a legal framework to adopt carbon credit in the Philippine domestic market. So in relationship with your presentation, actually, can you share your implication and view how the Philippine government's policy affected the liquidity or potential monetization of the carbon credit, including transition credit in the Philippine market?
Thanks for the question. It's a very good question, and I would add it's not unique to the Philippines. I think today about 80 jurisdictions or countries actually have carbon pricing schemes in place in various stages. And so this interaction between supply for domestic use and also what can be availed for international use is very important. And we have to also look at, when you start a journey in carbon pricing, what is the price that you started, right? Is it compelling enough to incentivize high quality project or revenue that will go into transition projects like SL Tech pilot? In my last slide, as I mentioned, there are ways where the government can actually ring-fence some credits for international voluntary market or also potentially for domestic use if there is a carbon pricing scheme where some of these credits can be channeled, if there is a flexibility mechanism for companies or entities that are exposed to the compliance scheme to use credits from sectors that are outside of the emissions trading scheme or carbon pricing or carbon tax scheme. So that's in short. So there are options, and I think that's actually a useful way to think about how we can ratchet ambition domestically through carbon pricing, and also utilize international market mechanism to incentivize good quality projects.
Yeah, thank you. It's very helpful.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sonuru from DBS Bank. Just want to understand, I think you mentioned as part of VM52 that one of the requirements is that at a country level, you should also have no new coal plants being built, right? So when it comes to Philippines, we understand that Philippines have a coal moratorium. But when you look at from a regional expansion perspective, right, in markets, Indonesia, Vietnam, still today is also still managing this energy trilemma in terms of affordability, energy security, also transition, right? So from methodology perspective on identifying transition credits, when it comes to those markets, what is your view in terms of an applicable methodology, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will add to that, there is this requirement, and I've received questions that only coal plants built before 2022 qualify, right? What about planned coal plants? And I think the general answer to this is whether there's any alternative financing mechanism to look at some of these phase out, early phase out or transition on a broader scale. And I think once we have a bit more clarity and confidence at both the facility, company, and also country level, jurisdictional level, that there is a transition pathway, more broadly long-term, then I think it's probably more suitable for carbon markets at this stage, right? Because as Ravi pointed out in the earlier panel, Ambassador Ravi pointed out, 1 in 7 tons is actually from coal plants in Asia, right? As a new asset class, and given 2022 was the year when we adopted first time a decision in UNFCCC around phase down of fossil fuels, probably that was a bit of the anchor on why there was that criteria. And that, I think, is a trigger not just from a power sector standpoint, but also policy and regulation standpoint. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but at least for now, for us at GenZero, I think we are looking at where it ticks the boxes.
Thank you, Ansa.
Caris?
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Charis. I'm from UKGov. So 2 questions. It's a 2-part question. The first part is how much analysis has gone into identifying the exact number of eligible CFPPs that would meet the requirements set out by Verra standards currently? So is there a rough number of how many globally would fit under this criteria? The second stage of that question is then, there seems to be a quite obvious link that ASIN, for example, has both the ownership over the CFPP, but also the ability to deploy RE quite effectively. Are all companies expected to have that linkage? Because if we have that 10% baseline up to that 40%, are we expecting that the companies that own the CFPPs also have the capabilities to build up the RE capacity to provide for the 40%? If not, would they require a different type of methodology? Would they need to move into investments in other types of RE deployment? And it also links a little bit into the within that 40%, and I know this quite well, so maybe for other people's benefit as well. What is the proportion of it that's just RE generation? What proportion of it should be within the storage, within grid upgrading and grid investments? So can you just talk us through a little bit of that, or maybe it'll come up later during financing? Thanks.
Yeah, to be honest, the analysis, I think there has been some analysis on, you have to look at the age of coal plants in the region today. And I think for Southeast Asia, a lot of the coal plants are actually quite new. So I would ostensibly think that there would be a good critical mass of coal plants that would be able to be eligible under this methodology. Then you layer on the screenings around the commitments and policy side, then you will probably whittle down the actual number of plants that are eligible and can use this methodology. Perhaps with other standards, they might have different requirements, and around other aspects, also around renewables replacement, they might have different criteria. Some might introduce 100%, right? And that might introduce its own further screening criteria. So it's hard to say what qualifies. Perhaps Verra does have the number, and I don't know whether South Pole also has any number at hand. But I would say, at least within this region, there is actually enough coal plants to use this methodology.
Yeah, I can come in on this not with a precise number, but the Rockefeller Foundation is sort of doing some analytical work around that to understand what might be the pipeline of eligible plants for this, and I'm pretty sure it's in the dozens, a few dozens. So hopefully the methodology indeed can be used several times. To your question on the 40% and the pairing, there are actually 5 ways of demonstrating the pairing. So the coal plant operator, owner, doesn't have to have the capacity of building renewable energy projects. It can actually be, for example, a contractual pairing where the PPA from the coal plant is passed on to the renewable energy producer. It could be a financial pairing where the packaging of the financing for 2 different companies is all encompassed. It could be on the same site, but operated by 2 different companies. So there are actually 5 different ways of demonstrating the pairing, and the causal effect from retiring a plant and building up renewable energy capacity is what we really cared about. And the methodology is also requires only 40% and not a full 100%, and that was heavily debated, as you can imagine, to accommodate for lots of different circumstances. There are many plants that are extremely large plants and would not actually have the capacity to fully replace from one day to the next by 100% capacity of renewable energy. The 40% is calculated based on the megawatt capacity, production capacity. And that's at the end of the crediting period. So there as well, there is flexibility to start with 10% at the beginning of at the validation of your project, and you need to ramp up to 40% by the end of the crediting period. Of course, there's a very strong incentive for a project proponent to ramp up renewable energy as fast as possible, because this is how you drive emission reductions and your carbon revenue. And there's a strong incentive, therefore, as well, of going way beyond 40% if you want to really take advantage of what the carbon market can offer.
If I can chime in, I know we're out of time, so I'll probably eat into the next session's time, which is shared by me anyway, so I have the right, I think, right, Fred? Anyway, just 2 quick answers. Number 1, in Southeast Asia, there's about 100 gigawatts or 100,000 megawatts of coal. Indonesia is the biggest, it's about 40 gigawatts, Philippines about 13. And half of those, that coal plant fleet is less than 15 years old. So, and most of them are contracted. So you can assume that at least there will be 50 gigawatts. That's about 200 times the size of SLTech. And that's Southeast Asia alone. So this is massive. We're very, very small compared to the size of opportunity in this region, let alone, the rest of Asia, China, India, Latin America, Africa is beyond that number. That's point 1. Point 2, you raise a very interesting question on, ASEN has made this shift 7 years ago. So we make it, quote unquote, look easy to replace a 246 megawatt plant because our pipeline in the Philippines is 15,000 megawatts of renewables. But some of our peers are the reverse. They have thousands of megawatts of coal plants and not 15,000 megawatts of renewables. So I think bottom line, and it's going to take time for organizations to build up the pipeline. So what I'm trying to say is I think after this proof of concept, to be truly scalable and replicable, we would need, I believe, some integrators. There is a role for a new class of organization which will play an integrator role, connecting the dots. This is a very complex ecosystem. It's partnership-based. It's, as I mentioned earlier, a whole-of-system approach. You need an integrator. Presumably from the private sector, it could also come from government sector, non-government organization, or both or all of the above. And part of that integration role is the matchmaking and deal-making between coal plant owners or sponsors and renewable energy developers, right? But it will be bespoke, and then you plug it into this replicable, scalable system. So hopefully that's giving us some hope in terms of how to solve some of these problems that you raised.
Okay, one final question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gracia from MTI. So I have 2 questions. The first is, do corporates require the ICBCM approval in order for them to consider off-taking? And the second question is how did we get to the minimum RE pairing of requirements of 40%, considering that we understand ASEAN can reach like up to 100%? Yeah, thank you.
You wanna answer the first one? Okay. Can you repeat the second one?
Yeah, how did we get to the minimum RE requirements of 40%?
Right. It's something that Frederick can respond to in terms of the methodology design, and also I invite Win. But it's got to do with what he mentioned earlier. It's about the practicality and the circumstance of the different sizes of coal plants and the diversity of coal plants that are existing today. And so I think to require 100% might not be practicable in the immediate sense. Of course, the criteria is at least 40%. So by all means, you can go above and beyond. And that's what I think the SL Tech pilot is trying to do, which is doing 100%.
I'll just answer the question about the demand really quickly, and I'll get more into this in my comments later. But the companies that we work with have, high integrity is one of their core values, and CCP eligibility from the Integrity Council is one way to meet that.
Ultimately, there might be corporates who might not require, but I think by and large, the CCP labels are seen to be a quality barometer for supply side. All right, we've overrun. Over to Brian. Thank you so much for your time, for your attention.
Thank you, Anshari, for anchoring that very insightful discussion on methodology. And thank you, everyone, for contributing your insights. Earlier today, Wee Sing from DBS shared his point of view on how transition credits can help mobilize capital at scale. Now, we have Eric Frenshaw, President and CEO of ASEAN, who will now take us through the lens of a project developer and operator to share more about the transition credit project. Ganesh Padmanabhan, Managing Director and Head of Project Finance at DBS, will join subsequently to discuss more about financing energy transition projects and risk allocation. The floor is yours now, Eric.
Thank you so much. I'm going ahead, Ganesh, yeah? Is it okay? That's not according to the script, but I'm good with that. All right. We went through this this morning, this earlier today already, so I'm not going to repeat the overview of the project. But again, as I said, many of you will visit the plant that's close to my heart because it's the first coal project that I've built. I'm both proud of it and not proud of it. I'm confused, I guess. But it is a very beautifully maintained plant. You'll see tomorrow. Every time I go to the site, I think twice, actually, whether to do this or not. But I have to remind myself of the greater good. And a gathering like this makes me stay committed to this course, no matter how challenging, difficult, and pristine the plant is. I promise you, Ambassador Ravi, that you will fall in love with the plant after this and then be confused, but we can discuss over drinks to push through with this nevertheless. Anyway, some highlights here. The plant produces steady baseload power, 1.8 billion kilowatt hours per year. Okay, steady, reliable baseload. And ASEAN remains as the off-taker, even if we sold it already, divested. To enable that ETM deal, we had to be the off-taker until 2040. Otherwise, there's no deal, okay? But it's allowing us to serve part of our transition plan because we cannot leapfrog overnight and just switch off the coal plant. This plays a very critical role in our overall portfolio. It is very cheap today. It's about 9 US cents, less than 5 pesos per kilowatt hour. That includes the fuel cost and the operations and maintenance and the capex recovery cost as well. Coal is still one of the cheapest baseload reliable technologies, like it or not, at least in the Philippines, right? It has about 200 workers plus some temporary workers. Probably the total, if you include temporary workers, about 500-600 people altogether. The emissions, though, is quite high. It's 1.9 million tons per year on average. Not quite the 1.8 million, Anshari. It's closer to 1.9 than 1.8 million. And again, we started operations in 2015 for Unit 1 and for Unit 2, 2016. So we're committed to shut it down, retire it by 2040. or after 25 years of operations. But we are hoping to accelerate that with the use of transition credits and effect a just transition, as well as replace it in a responsible manner with a clean energy replacement. So how does the clean energy replacement look like? Again, this is our latest thinking. It can evolve over time, but this is our best thinking right now. We are going to replace a 246 megawatt of 2 units. That's 2 units of SLTech, Unit 1 and Unit 2. So we could replace it with 2 units also, if you will, of clean energy replacement. So Unit 1 will be replaced by 200 megawatt solar plus battery storage, and then multiply that by 2, so it's 2 times 200 megawatts, so to replace both units. And by the way, based on the project methodology, Vera methodology, or carbon principles, core carbon principles, the retirement of a coal plant, can be done on a per unit basis. It doesn't have to be all or nothing on a whole plant. So we can do this in a phased manner. So 2 by 200 megawatts. What does that actually mean? So this is 400 megawatts. You might wonder why 400, not 246. Well, the reason is, yes, we can replace it on a literally 100% like-for-like basis, which is 24/7. Then we would only need 246 megawatts, or 2 by 123. But that will be very expensive, right? So, and frankly speaking, based on what the system needs today, the system needs more what we call mid-merit, which is the 12-hour supply of power from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. is the most critical, because that's when the peak demand of the grid is, not at 3 a.m. Why would we produce the expensive solar battery at 3 a.m. if the grid demand at that time is very low? So there is a pragmatic, practical, grid bespoke element to this technical solution. But battery needs to be incorporated. That's non-negotiable for us and arguably for the Philippine government, right? We need to be responsible. So this system will basically consist of 1,400 megawatts or 700 megawatts of solar panels. That's about 700 hectares of land each, right? This is 1 megawatt, 1 hectare. So 1,400 if you look at both units. And then we will need 4 hours of battery storage. So 400 megawatts times 4 hours, that's what the 1,600 megawatt hours means. It's estimated to produce more than 1,800 gigawatt hours, or 1.8 billion kilowatt hours. Basically, on year 1, actually, this is estimated to produce 2 billion kilowatt hours per year. We're purposely oversizing the plant because solar plants degrade by about 0.5% per year. And we want to make sure that we are not falling short of the replacement energy. That's why we are being on the conservative side and overproducing from an output perspective. And as we mentioned, it's 1-to-1 pairing. The estimated project cost, although we hope to improve on this, is about $1.5 billion US. The coal plant, when we built it 15 years ago, 10 years ago, was worth $500 million. But we have to pay for the coal, for the fuel. Here, fuel is free because the sun is free, fortunately. But the capex is much higher. But the what we call the levelized cost of electricity is higher than coal plant today. That's about 13 to 15 US cents per kilowatt hour. So there is a gap. So that gap is about 30 to 35%. This is 30 to 35% more expensive than what we are paying SLTech for the coal plant output. We need to cover that gap of 30 to 35%. You do the simple math here. 30 to 35% of $1.5 billion. I'm just oversimplifying with a ratio and proportion, but that is not too wrong. That's about $500 million. Lower gap if we're able to lower this because of lower battery prices and so forth, right? or optimization for the renewable configuration. So orders of magnitude to keep customers, investors, et cetera, whole on the clean energy replacement, we need roughly $500, hopefully less, $1 million of subsidy so that the pricing will be at least the same. Now, we also, and I'll get back to that later. So basically, we, on the left side here, you will see that the crediting period, and we can get to the transition financing, the securitization that was discussed earlier by Wiseng. But the crediting period is going to be 2031 to 2040, and therefore the carbon credit revenues will be generated in the future. But as you can imagine, we will need the subsidy, the funding upfront. We will have to start building the clean energy replacement in 2028 if we are to complete the plant by 2030. While Vera methodology allows us to replace just 10% on year 1 and 40% by year 10, in this case, we want to replace 100% on year 1, on day 1. In fact, on day negative 180, because we want this clean energy replacement to be operating well before, 6 months before the coal plant is shut down. So basically, there is a mismatch of timing of cash flows, and Ganesh and I, hopefully, we can discuss the securitization of those cash flows as well. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about the key off-takers. I'll leave that to Nat in a bit in the next session. But the uses of the transition credit proceeds, I think I already double-clicked on point number 3, which is a CR subsidy, and that is why this is taking the lion's share, 50 to 60%. The next large use of proceeds is number 1, which I discussed during the panel. We have to keep everyone whole. And orders of magnitude, that's probably in the sub-$300 million range. The coal plant makes an EBITDA of about $60+ million per year. So if you did your financial analysis here, you're going to come up with a number that's on a net present value somewhere in the $250, $300 million, depending on your discount rates and so forth. So plus the other, 2%, as Frederick mentioned, of the proceeds to ensure a just transition for the community and so forth, we would then come up with these other sources or uses of funding, which comes up to about 50, 40, 10, roughly, split of use of proceeds. Now, again, these numbers are a work in progress. We're trying to sharpen the numbers so that the more savings we get, and again, financing will be a big part of this. The lower cost financing there is, the lower the subsidy will be, because we want as low a carbon price as possible to make it more accessible to more off-takers. But we cannot sacrifice this, the high quality nature of this transition initiative. So let me leave it at this and invite Ganesh over to speak about other dynamics of transition financing.
Thank you, Eric. Let me pick on 2 things that Eric just said. One, stakeholders need to be kept whole. And second, this project involves capital mobilization. Perhaps, Eric, if you don't mind staying on stage, it could be a bit better. Let me welcome you. Yeah. So the second thing is capital mobilization at scale. Okay? A complex project of this nature, which is clearly cross-border in its scope, requires the support of all the stakeholders who have gathered here. Everyone from, I can see my banker friends here, the verification agencies, the off-takers, the developers who are key. So everyone needs to come together. Now, DBS has been at the forefront on advising on a number of these first-of-its-kind projects, be it the ETM, carbon capture, green ammonia, cross-border grids, and so on and so forth. So we are hopeful that we can contribute meaningfully to this project as well. So when we think about financing, perhaps, and if you could switch to the next slide. Yeah. We first, as bankers, we like our schematics. we want to draw what is the role that key sponsors play, and what is it that we are trying to finance here. This is not new to a lot of people, but let me just quickly go through. You have at the center of it the SL Tech plant, which needs to be shut down. At the bottom up panel of this is the replacement asset, which Eric spoke about. And then this leads to creation of transition credits, effectively, and very simplistically, with off-takers who are going to buy these transition credits and provide a payment or a cash flow. So we need to look at this in a number of ways in terms of how can we use this cash flow to provide economic support or financing support. And I think Eric showed in the last slide a pie chart in terms of the use of proceeds. So that use of proceeds is what we are trying to solve for. So that's our job to be done. That's the first thing. Okay, next. Again, so the second thing we need to identify is the transition credits are a complement to what has already been done. Right? We've already accelerated, or rather already taken this plant and we are shortening it to 2040. The transition credit is going to solve for a further reduction to 2030, right? And that involves a certain financial impact. Again, we're going to solve for that. If you see the right-hand side, this is where the sale of credits, verification, and the off-takers who are then producing cash flows to pay to the financiers. Now, the way we have structured this for bankability, and the second thing bankers like a lot, is risks. So we will walk through, and I'm hoping that all the stakeholders will contribute meaningfully to this conversation. We will walk through a very broad framework of risk allocation, and I think Wee Seng alluded to this in his panel as well. We can cover a few risks, we can go through these, and then try and solve for how do we allocate it to the person who's best placed to take this, okay? Next slide. All right, I've got 6 key risks, and we have split it up into a number of parts. The first section is obviously risks which are in the control of the developer. ASEN, one of the most reputed conglomerates in Philippines with an exceptional track record of implementing projects and a great pipeline of renewable energy, right? Then the project itself. It is clearly split into 3 parts. The first is the commissioning of the renewable energy, the replacement capacity that we are talking about, and the operation of the replacement energy. The second part is the decommissioning risk itself. This is the decommissioning of the coal-fired project, and I think Wee Seng mentioned this. The job to be done is to keep this closed for the next 10 years, is to not allow it to operate. The first part we are familiar with in project finance. We are financing a CapEx where the plant has to operate and generate cash flows. The third part where the use of proceeds is going is the just transition plan, and we heard about it earlier in the panel as well in terms of what is being done to support, retrain, and put workers at a different, employ them meaningfully as well. So these 3 entail costs itself. So perhaps, again, this begs the first question again, and maybe I might need to look at Frederick to give us a view on this. Clearly, the construction risk of the clean energy project is predicated on the developer because they control the EPC, they have the wherewithal, they have the expertise to do this. But what if that construction of that project gets delayed, right, beyond 2030? The decommissioning has started, but that construction of that project is delayed. Of course, the EPC will have penalties and so on and so forth. But the question that begs the answer is, what happens to the volume of transition credits that is being generated? So we wanted to generate 1.5 gigs in terms of renewable power, but it's been delayed by a year. Perhaps, maybe Frederick, if you could.
Conveniently sitting there. Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. The obvious impact is that the delta between the baseline emissions that would have been emitted if the plant had continued operating and the emissions of the project would actually be larger if the renewable energy is not actually commissioned and operating on time as expected, right? So that means lower carbon revenue on a yearly basis, so lower emission or lower issuance of carbon credits, and therefore lower carbon revenue. Yeah. And should ACEN have accepted to take the risk of guaranteeing a certain volume to a buyer, then that would come with other penalties as well for under delivering on the promised carbon credits.
Yeah, thanks for that, Frederick. And I can just supplement this. This is where I think the structuring plays an important role itself, which is assessing what is the energy that plant will generate, right? On a P90 basis or a P75 basis, that is one. Second, we spoke about the 40% threshold earlier. And as long as the CER meets that 40% threshold, can it still access that revenue stream, which is being used to plug the financing gap that we are in? So those are the things which we will have to solve during diligence and during construction as well.
Ganesh, can I just chime in here to provide some real-time feedback on these risks? Because, and we just had a joint venture meeting this morning to precisely talk about this. And I think, look, and this is part of a lessons learned that should be shared with everyone who tries to do this thing. As I mentioned earlier, replacing a coal plant like 246 megawatts is a daunting task that will require, as you see, 1,400 megawatts of solar or 1,400 hectares of land and a large transmission infrastructure, right? It's easy to build a 50 or 100 megawatt project. Projects are hardly delayed if you are just connecting to a lower voltage line. Our experience with ACEN is that once you go to 230 kV or 500 kV, expect some delays. So for example, our largest solar plant now, which is in San Marcelino, Zambales, which is where this project will connect, that was a project that was 1 year delayed. So in a way, we already paid tuition fee for that. And the reason why we chose Botolan, Zambales, which is 22 kilometers north of our existing solar plant today, is that this is a de-risked option. The connection to the grid is already there, and we have a lot of capacity left in that system. This is our philosophy. We play the long game, we go for scale. We take the punches. The investors punished us because of these delays, but these are natural. Even the national grid faces 3, 4, 5 years of delay, so 1 year is not so bad, no? So now all we need to do is to do a 22-kilometer line from our new site on the north to our already connected site. What we're doing now, we're not taking it lightly. The de-risking there is the right of way, purchasing the land over 22 kilometers. And that activity is already ongoing. We're not going to wait for 2028 for that. 2028, we should be done, and this should be largely de-risked. No?
Yeah.
Just to give you a call.
Those are wonderful points. And sorry, go ahead, Fred.
Thanks. I think it's also important, and I wonder whether we should also study the issue of this. You know, the shutting down of one unit in a coal plant would mean, say, the 125 megawatt, right? Half of it is done. So even if the solar can do up to about 40%, there is actually a step change in deciding to shut or not shut, because unless you are actually throttling the capacity of the coal plant down to match exactly what you have on the solar. So I just wonder, from a methodological point of view, if you were actually deliberately throttling down the capacity output of the coal plant, can you still credit for the 40%? You can't, right? Or you can? You get what I mean? Because it's a 1-0 decision to shut or not shut.
No, so is the question saying should we shut down only one unit and replace it with capacity?
No, not that. Because
ramp it down.
Yeah, ramp it down. Because the problem here is that your renewables are being delayed. Let's just say, right? The construction.
Have faith in us, Fred. It will not be.
No, of course not.
Yeah,
no,
theoretically.
Yeah, but theoretically.
I get it.
So
I get it.
When the thing is being delayed, you have a cash flow shortfall because the transition credits cannot come out.
Correct.
So then the issue is that actually we are faced with some impossible choices. One is you continue to run the coal plant,
Yeah.
in which case then you don't get the transition credit revenues, but presumably you get the revenues from the PPA, but with the reputational hit of continuing with the coal plant while doing this project. Or two, let's just say if the solar is about 50% there, can it operate at a 50% thing? It passes the minimum threshold, but then if you don't shut the coal plant, you can't get the credits anyway. And so there is a sense in, can you throttle down in order to use the 50% or not?
So the methodology plans for the decommissioning. So there's no sort of phasing out slowly, but at the same time, and as you've said, Eric, already, there is the possibility of decommissioning one of the two turbines fully. So the idea behind this is to make sure that a turbine cannot be repurposed or restarted.
Right. Also, from a regulatory perspective, Fred, we cannot do that. We have a
Exactly.
must-offer
So which is
rule.
why it is trickier for us when we're
Yes.
thinking about potential delays, because it's either 0, 1, or 2, as the guys were saying.
Yes.
You can't throttle one. I mean, you can't, you got to close down one. Yeah, it's closing down one.
So this is the COD risk, the project completion risk, which we mentioned in the panel, right? What comprises a project and what comprises the completion of the project, which then gets you eligible to carbon credits. So, okay, perhaps in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly switch to a few other things. And if you notice here, we've talked about the transition credit delivery risk and the performance risks. We spoke about the delay scenario, okay? But there is another scenario, which is if the sun does not shine, if the CER doesn't perform to a P90 or a generation profile, again, transition credits are affected because you don't get access to that as well. So that's again a risk which we are taking as well. The delivery risk also then points to certain verification and credible verification by counterparties and the demand for those verification itself. So those are again aspects which will need to be addressed as part of the structuring itself. And this is a reason, if you notice, we have kind of highlighted this in both red and black, because it is within the developer's control as well in terms of performance and completion, but as well outside of the developer's control, because then there are other parties who also need to act and be able to support this. The important thing as well, which I wanted to bring out here is, what happens if there are externalities which then affect the project, which is political force majeure, which we spoke about. How do we then think about mitigating that risks? And which is where I believe there could be a role for the likes of ECAs or multilaterals to come in and step in and take that political risk itself, right? And obviously there needs to be a very big role for the governments to play also and agree on it as well in terms of what needs to happen for this mechanism to work efficiently across. But obviously as financiers, both investors as well as lenders will look towards some form of political risk mitigation itself, right? The third aspect, of course, then is force majeure itself, physical force majeure. What happens if the plant is damaged? And essentially it points to the CERs, the replacement asset which then gets damaged. There could be potentially an insurance which is available, but during the time that project is shut, again, transition credits are affected. The volume of cash that is available, the amount of cash flow that is available is not adequate. The third question again, Eric, you mentioned about the use of proceeds, right? The thing which we need to solve for is the transition credits is to be verified and the certificate printed at a future date. So the commodity or the unit doesn't exist even at the time of the shutdown. The unit is born only at the end of the year on a look-back basis. So there is no tangible commodity per se, which then cannot be. So what are financiers hanging their hat on, right? So I think I would throw this question out to the audience to kind of think through saying, do we need upfront capital? Do we need all of this capital upfront to go in? Or can some of it come in on a stage basis over the duration of the 10 years? And I'll give you an example. One is the LCOE gap. The LCOE gap only is needed as you generate, right? Let's say if it's the mid plant is about 9 cents, whereas the LCOE is 13 cents, you only need it during the operations of the CER. So there might be an opportunity to actually get that cash flow in during the course of the 10 years, and you don't maybe probably don't need all of it upfront. So what we are trying to do here is, maybe the magnitude of this problem is not $1 billion. It might only be 100 million today, and the remaining 900 comes over the next 10 years.
Can I clarify that, Ganesh, just to put things very tangibly, particularly for the SLTech project? Yeah. So just to clarify, that gap between 9 cents and let's say 13 cents, so basically what's going to happen here is that the off-taker, in this case ASEN, will get rid of the contract of the coal plant where we're paying 9 cents. Now we're going to buy from this solar plus storage also, let's say for now, at 9 cents, or not too far away from 9 cents. We're not going to pay 13 cents, which is the market price. So that's clarification number one. So therefore, the upfront capex becomes a problem. You know, the investors, present company included, will require a market return. Our partners don't run a charity. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, but anyway. Maybe you're the first loss capital. No, that's for discussion behind closed doors. But anyway, and that's why the use of proceeds number 3 here, right, is the CER subsidy. That's an upfront thing. It's spread between 2028, in our case, which is the financial close, and then we'll need that subsidy, de facto subsidy, until 2030. Right. So that's, as I mentioned, that's about 500 million, more or less, hopefully lower, 400, what have you. And then because really, this is a $1.8 billion cash pool, envelope size, right? 1.5 billion for the CER, 300 for the just transition, and so forth. That's the use of funds. The source is roughly 800 would be from the transition credits. That's why we're seeing this in the $40-ish range, right? Maybe 700 million of project finance. The project finance attached to the clean energy replacement. And then roughly $300 million of equity from our joint venture sponsors. That's how you break down the sub 2 billion, call it 1.8 billion, right? And the different sources of capital. So therefore, since there's a lot of bankers in the room, there are 2 opportunities here. There's the project finance, and then there's the securitization of the cash flows. The project finance, orders of magnitude, $700 million. We would love blended finance in there so that the subsidy will be lower, right? So the blended finance could be a combination of concessionary capital and market-based loans, right? So that's an opportunity. Now there's a lot of local financing available here for the project finance, and then hopefully the multilaterals, whether it's ADB, IFC, and the like, or maybe the FAST-P program can participate in the concessionary side. The other bucket really is the securitization. That's the more challenging part. Yes. We've got square brackets, $800 million, net present value, maybe $1 billion, or depending on your cost of capital. Hopefully, if the cost of capital is 0, then we just need $800 million over 10 years, right? So who in this room will securitize that, will come up with that cash between 2028 and 2030, because we cannot afford to wait for 10 years. Or 13 years, right? So that's really the crux of the question. The order of magnitude is 700-800 million, just under $1 billion. That's the $1 billion question on something that is yet to be created.
Yeah, perfect.
Right?
Eric, and I think that's a perfect segue, obviously, into the next section also, which talks about the offtake, because the offtakers, our buyers, are going to provide that cash flow which then supports the securitization. But these essentially are the building blocks of that securitization.
Yes.
Unless we solve for the risk allocation, the securitization probably will take time itself. Right?
Yes.
And that's where, again, we have the next one which we have identified again is the market risk or the counterparty risk. And here, what we are looking for, and most financiers and investors are looking for, is a firm offtake from a credible counterparty at a certain price, which ensures the certainty of the cash flow, which I can securitize, right? So that becomes critical. Obviously, the off-takers want verified, credible credits, which I think we've already spoken at length about, yeah? Perhaps, and Eric, any insights on how you're approaching the off-take markets itself? What are you seeing in terms of demand and appetite in the market?
This will be a fantastic segue to the next session, but to set it up, really we're looking at a number of markets. One is the compliance, the sovereign buyers. Sovereign you can break up into literally the government buying against their NDCs, right? And then a subset of that are the corporates, e.g. corporates in Singapore who are under a compliance market, right? So that's bucket one. And then bucket two would be the voluntary market participants. And this is where NAT and Kinetic Coalition is playing a leading role. So those are broadly speaking, the two sources. Now, and we believe that this needs to scale. If this demand side scales up, that will make it easier for the supply side to scale up as well, as long as we're successful in terms of demonstrating this proof of concept. Now, it's not easy. If you look at the sovereign buyers, Singapore by far is the only compliance market that we know of that has opened its carbon borders to the extent of 5%, right, of the total carbon tax. We're hoping that Japan will follow suit. And it's no coincidence that we're partners with Mitsubishi, who hopefully will help us get there. We're working closely with the Japanese government as well, because Japan is going to an ETS structure a la Europe in a couple of years' time, and we're hopeful that, unlike Europe, they will open up the carbon market so that we can participate. There's talk there's a pending legislation in European Union to open up sovereign buying up to 3%. So that's exciting, 2036. We discussed this with Frederick this morning. But that's a longer term opportunity. You know, Australia and New Zealand, Ambassador is here, Ambassador, good afternoon, have carbon markets, but for now, these are all, like Europe, are domestic. Not going to put you on the spot, Ambassador, don't worry. But these are mid to long-term opportunities, right? But the near-term opportunities, I guess, are Singapore and Japan on the compliance and sovereign buying, hopefully more like Sweden, the Swedish ambassador was here, and Switzerland are also known to support Article 6 and so forth. And then on the voluntary corporate side, again, the Amazons, Googles, Salesforce, Metas of the world, you know, McDonald's, we saw some of the logos earlier, and Nat will be discussing the opportunities in that sector. So we're working closely with the different stakeholders to unlock the demand side. We're prepared to be the first to solve the supply and hopefully scale this up later on. But early days, but it's exciting one, a lot of challenges, but this is very helpful.
Indeed, indeed. Perhaps I think at this stage we just throw it open out for the audience. Maybe we saying if you want
I just got a comment to make. I notice the time is up, right? But I just got a comment to make about the financing that rather than see it as two separate streams, that this is what we call in project finance an integrated project. So I don't think it'll be very healthy to look at it as two different securitized one piece, because effectively we have two streams, right? A 9 cent stream for which the project financiers will finance a debt size based on the 9 cents, and we have another stream called transition credits, which gives you the delta. So that's another cash flow stream. But we do see that obviously it's integrated because one must go with the other. Otherwise, nobody gets any cash flow. So I think there needs to be that whoever comes in to bank this probably needs to take an integrated view, hopefully be on both sides so that you align interests. But otherwise, there needs to be very strong intercreditor alignment to ensure that this whole thing takes off. Yeah, that's just a comment.
That's very helpful input. I think our CFO is here and treasurer, so I'm sure you're taking down notes.
The time's up, but if there are any questions, we can probably pick this up during the reception in the evening. Feel free to engage each other and have this very constructive discussion. Thank you, Eric, for
Thank you,
having
Ganesh,
us, and it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Ganesh, Eric, and everyone for contributing to the very enlightening discussion on financing transition credit projects. Finally, we will go into our last discussion of the day around catalyzing demand. In the carbon markets, supply quality has been improving with meta standards and carbon ratings. Infrastructure is being set up with evolving regulatory oversight and clarity. However, demand remains the biggest uncertainty and hurdle to scaling. Ned Kilhern, President of Kinetic Coalition, and Diana Tan, Deputy Director, Carbon Mitigation from the Ministry of Trade and Industry Singapore, will share updates on guidance on how energy transition credits can be used and the importance of both voluntary and compliance demands. Once again, we remind the audience that the deep dive sessions are conducted under the Chatham House rule. Over to you, Ned.
All right, well, thanks so much to GenZero and ASIN and the organizers. I think Diana and I have the very, the coveted last slot just before the reception. But we're going to talk about demand. I'm going to talk about private corporate demand and what the Kinetic Coalition is doing to generate that, and then Diana will come up and talk about sovereign demand. As Eric said, those are the kind of two big chunks. I mean, you could divide it a little bit more into sovereigns, as Eric said, corporates who are meeting compliance demand pursuant to a regulatory process, and then corporates that are meeting, that are buying credits for voluntary climate commitments, and that's mostly what I'll talk about here. But I first want to tell you a little bit about the Kinetic Coalition and what we do, because while in this particular instance with SL Tech, we're primarily coming in as a buyer coalition, we're part of that broader ecosystem trying to drive the whole energy transition credits forward as well. So I'll share a little bit about that and then get into what we're seeing on the buyer side, particularly with respect to the current pilots. So this is just about us. We are actually I run an organization called C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We work on a range of policies in the climate and energy space. We are the Secretariat for Kinetic Coalition. So that's my role here. We have a whole team, but I was the one who drew the lucky straw to come out to Manila. What do we, sort of broadly speaking, who's involved? As I said, Kinetic Coalition is run by C2S, my organization. We were launched in May of 2025. We have roots in what was known as the Energy Transition Accelerator, as Anshari said, but we're really a new initiative that came out of some of the work that had been done in that group. We've been collaborating closely with a number of partners, maybe two that are most worth mentioning here. We've been lucky to collaborate very closely with MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the Traction Initiative that they had earlier launched. We've kind of brought our threads together in a sense on that. We're also working very closely with the World Bank, particularly around the Dominican Republic pilot that I'll speak briefly about. But the bank obviously brings enormous credibility and analytical capacity in particular for many of the countries that we're considering working with. So what does Kinetic Coalition do? We think about it in three pillars, and when I speak more to the buyer engagement, that's really one of these pillars. Part of it is just, as I said, we think about ourselves as part of the ecosystem to drive and promote and catalyze a market for energy transition credits alongside the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of our core partners, alongside MAS and Traction and so many others in the room. We particularly focus on advancing pilot transactions for energy transition credits. I'll tell you a little bit more about the pilots in that case, but or in a few minutes, but what Kinetic does, we've got a team that is working with Rockefeller and others to sort of identify what projects or countries we could work with to really kick the tires on those opportunities
and then to bring buyers and sellers together. In the case of SL Tech, there was already a seller, and we're really bringing the buyers. But in other cases, we envision ourselves as helping to put both sides of the market together. And then finally, and I'll speak a little bit about this later, and it may come up in the questions, we see a core part of our work in terms of that kind of ecosystem facilitation as working with standards bodies like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, like Greenhouse Gas Protocol, like ICVCM, which was mentioned earlier, to really build confidence and awareness around high integrity energy transition credits and create opportunities for companies to use them. We've heard a lot about methodologies today, so I won't go too much into this. Anshari did a great deep dive. I'll just note that we are thinking, we think pretty broadly about the methodologies and the kinds of credits we're interested in using, recognizing that these two types of methodologies might be appropriate in different settings. So on the one hand, where there is an opportunity to decommission a coal plant or a large unit of a coal plant and replace it with renewables, as in the case of South Luzon, we think the asset-based approach is a great one to pursue, and that we are, as Anshari mentioned, there are other methodologies being developed. We see the leading one being the one that we've heard about before from Vera and the Coal to Clean initiative. We're also looking at an energy, what we think about as an energy system approach. Anshari used the more technical sort of jargony term, jurisdictional approach, same thing. That approach, as Anshari mentioned, is there's a methodology being developed by Winrock. One way to think about that energy system approach is, and I won't go into the methodological details, but that energy system approach means that you can draw on emissions reductions that take place over the entire system. From anything from ramping down, there was this earlier question, Fred, around sort of could you ramp down the coal plant but not all the way. At an asset-based methodology, you really need to be decommissioning a coal plant, putting it in, more than mothballs, shutting it down for good, because it's really honing entirely around that one asset, and you want to make sure you're really closing down that coal plant. On an energy system approach, you could imagine reducing emissions across an entire grid through a range of actions, maybe ramping down the coal plants, dispatching others more frequently over time. So you'd have more breadth. The trade-off there is it's a little more complicated to calculate the baselines, and there are some additional issues. So these are complementary. Some of the asset-based approach might work well in some instances, the energy system approach in another instance. We think it's valuable to have both approaches in the quiver. So I mentioned the pilots. These are the 3 pilots we're currently working on as Kinetic, and they look quite different, in part because that's the kind of point of a pilot. We're really interested in trying out different approaches, seeing what works, learning. Ravi said this at the very beginning. We need to learn, see what works, incorporate that, iterate if we want to scale this up. And I think that's what really everybody who's been talking about it today has really aimed. We're not looking for one transaction. We're not looking for one coal plant. We're looking for a new market. So I'll talk more about the Philippines. I mean, we've heard a lot about the Philippines project, especially from Eric just now. That's one on the asset-based side. We're also working, and I'll speak a little bit more about the Dominican Republic just in a minute. We're working with the Dominican Republic and with Chile for this sort of energy system approach. So I won't go into this in detail because Eric just presented all of it. This is the South Luzon project, the SL Tech project that Eric just mentioned. For this project, what we're really doing as Kinetic is bringing some of the corporate voluntary buyers, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But Eric's talked about the project itself. I'll just mention briefly the Dominican Republic project, or the pilots, so you get a sense of the breadth. This is an energy systems approach. In other words, it's looking at a jurisdictional scale or across the entire grid. This is using that methodology that Winrock is developing. And so what this will entail is a kind of performance baseline for the country as a whole, for the electric grid as a whole, that's based on historical factors, current conditions, circumstances going forward, and so on. And then a plan, the Dominican Republic is putting a plan together, undergirded and supported by modeling and analysis from the World Bank. And the idea is that if and when we get this pilot off the ground, and we're in advanced conversations with Dominican Republic, by implementing some of those investments in reducing emissions across the grid, they would create that delta between the baseline and actual emissions, and those reduced emissions would be the source of the credits that would then be generated at that kind of energy system level. So we've been working with the Dominican Republic. We had We had a session with the government in Santo Domingo earlier this summer. We're doing another session in New York, and we're continuing to bring that forward. So how do we think about business engagement? And I'll just spend a couple of slides on this before handing it over to Diana. First, who are the businesses we're engaging with? You can see some of this in the blue box. I'll come over here so I'm not blocking the view. You can see some of the blue box on the left. We've got a group of companies, kind of blue chip, high-level companies we've been working with for a couple of years now, actually dating back to that Energy Transition Accelerator effort. Some of them are listed here. I want to be careful. These are these are companies that have said, we want to come along on this journey with you. We're interested enough on this that we will be joining monthly calls, and we'll be digging in with you on the methodologies, and we'll be digging in with you on what use cases might look like. None of them has signed on the dotted line to commit to anything, but they have said, we're really interested in these energy transition credits, and we want to be part of this coalition. And we've got about half a dozen of these now that have said, not only are we generally interested, but we're specifically interested in digging in on that LCLTech transaction and working very closely. And that number I think, will grow over time as we get more details on the transaction. So we've got a subset of these that are also working with us on a much more fine-grained basis on each of the pilot transactions. And so what we think about, what we think about the value propositions of Kinetic, first of all, we can aggregate demand among our companies, and so we can bring a set of companies, a voluntary demand to a project or to a country, which both amplifies the impact that those companies can have, but also makes the transaction easier because it's with a group rather than individually. We also provide some of the quality assurance that our companies are looking for. We can kick the tires on the projects and the countries that we're working with. And the end result, of course, is the impact that we're looking for the results. So what do our companies look for? Really, they look for two things at the bottom. I mean, they look for a lot of things from us, but they're looking for two things from carbon credits. The first is high integrity, and that comes back to the methodologies we've been talking about. So that's why we're working, we're only looking at the kind of the crediting methodologies that have been not only put in place or finalized under one of the top crediting programs like Verra, like Winrock, but we're also, this question came up earlier, we've said we're only going to use credits that are CCP eligible, that are approved by or eligible under the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So we're looking for ICVCM as a third party to say, yes, these credits meet that standard. And you heard earlier about ICVCM considering, the Verra methodology is underway, and Winrock, when it completes the methodology, will be submitting that. The second thing our companies say is, we need to have a business case. Eric has said several times his investors are not a charity. The companies that we are listed in that box, those are not charities either. They need a business case for using the credits, and that's where a lot of our time actually has been focused on that. And so I will just wrap up on that piece. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail, but this gives you a sense there's a lot of ways a company, in our view, could use a credit. We're not going to be prescriptive, but we're working with companies to open up some of these pathways to use them. So I'll talk about the top two a little bit more in detail, but you could think about, for those of you who are familiar with the kind of scopes 1, 2, 3, greenhouse gas protocol, et cetera, you could think about using these credits towards scope 2 emissions, towards scope 3 emissions, towards emissions generally, that's the third use case, as a contribution to global decarbonization, not as an offset or a compensation. That would be sort of beyond the value chain. You can also think about them used for compliance purposes, and that's what Diana will come to in a minute. I want to focus in on just those top two, because I think those are the most interesting ones. This third one has a lot of reputational risk, I think. As an economist, I think it would be great, but a lot of companies are concerned about the reputational risk of just offsetting in general. And the fourth one really does look more like a charity. But the first two, I think, are really promising in terms of allowing companies to use credits or creating a pathway where they could use credits to address their emissions. And they both have to do with using credits to address emissions in the value chain. Obviously, scope 2, as people will know, is for purchased electricity. That really requires, since we're working in emerging economies, that requires that a company be purchasing electricity in that country. That is true for some. It's kind of a narrow case for many. The case we're really excited about is this bottom case number 2 here, which is the Scope 3 case. And the basic idea there is, think about any major company like the ones we had listed before that has global supply chains. Much of what think about Amazon for a minute, just because they start with A, so they're the first one on the list. Also, it's an easy one to think about, right? They have massive supply chains. Think about how much of the goods and services in their supply chains are being produced in developing countries and emerging economies with their suppliers drawing electricity from the grid, right? That's going to be a significant chunk of their supply chain emissions. And you can think about that with other companies as well. From our point of view, energy transition credits, which represent real verified emissions reductions in the electric power sector in those same countries, that represents the best way, in my view, to address those supply chain emissions. And so that's the case we are making to SBTI, to GHCP, and others with our companies, that this use case, to use these credits to address emissions in supply chains that are related to electricity, that should be a kind of gold standard use case. There's some more detail on the right. We can go into it if folks are interested. The basic story, the basic point on the right, and this is where I'll end, is that when you get into the sort of details of accounting, you have to make some arguments about why this, how you match up electricity emissions in the supply chain to these credits. And there's a question about how closely you need to match geographically. And we would say, look, if companies can match their suppliers to the same country as they're getting an energy transition credit, that's great. But there are a lot of logistical reasons that might be tough, and we want finance to flow. And so from our point of view, we think it would be great to allow as much matching, as much flexibility as possible, at least in the early stage. But those are the kinds of technical issues that are going to be worked out through Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, and so on. The bottom line here, and this is where I'll finish up and hand it over to Deanna, is we've got significant interest from our companies, and we're adding to that all the time. So if there are companies in the room you want to be part of Kinetic, come up to me afterwards. And a lot of the work we're doing is not only specifically on the pilot transactions, but also on this broader ecosystem, including creating these use cases. And I think if we are successful in opening the pathway for these use cases, we're going to see very significant demand from the voluntary sector easily in the kind of millions and tens of millions of tons that could really power a lot of the transactions we're talking about. So with that, let me stop and hand it over to Deanna.
Great, thank you, Nat. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. I'm Deanna from the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry. So in case any of you are not familiar, just a quick preamble on why we are here. Really, Singapore is one of many sovereigns, right, who have made net zero commitments. We've made net zero commitments by 2050. And in order for us to reach that goal, we will need to rely on international collaboration with various countries, and that includes direct sourcing of Article 6 carbon credits. Singapore does that through two main ways, really. We have a carbon tax, a broad-based carbon tax that covers about 80% of our emissions. And our companies under this carbon tax regime can use international carbon credits to offset up to 5% of their emissions. And the Singapore government, represented by the Ministry of Trade and Industry, is also leading additional sourcing directly for the government to meet our NDCs. So that's what we're looking at when we talk about transition credits today. Right, so Nat already spoke about what corporates are looking for in terms of transition credits. And I think what sovereigns are looking for, not too far off. I mean, we're looking at similar requirements, but to add on and layer to that, certainly what we will also need to look for, firstly, is Article 6 compliance for us to be able to use that towards our NDCs. And on practical terms, that means we are prioritizing countries where we are actively negotiating bilateral implementation agreements. So actually all the countries that Nat listed just now with the pilot projects are countries that we are in negotiations with, and in particular, of course, we are looking at a bilateral with the Philippines for Article 6. He also talked about high integrity. So for sovereigns, I think that's kind of a unique circumstance, right? Every sovereign has their own compliance regime, and Singapore is no different. We have our own eligibility criteria. If you studied it, it currently looks quite similar. We take reference from different international standards. So we take reference, for example, from CORSIA. So in some sense, I would say we are somewhat interoperable with CORSIA's scheme. But we do have an eligibility criteria. And for us to offtake any credits, fundamentally, the credits firstly need to meet Singapore's eligibility criteria. But secondly, because these are ultimately bilateral agreements, whatever is on Singapore's whitelist that we publish on our website, under each agreement has to be bilaterally negotiated, right? So we also need, for example, the Philippines to agree with us before we add any new methodologies to our whitelist. So that's Singapore's approach. And finally, on cost effectiveness for sovereigns, right? We are also subject to making sure that whatever we purchase comes under a lot of scrutiny, and so we need to uphold certain broad principles in terms of fair and open competition, transparent access, and making sure that we have gotten fair value for money. So I thought it was quite interesting presentations earlier, right? And we do need to go down to the numbers to understand what exactly the public money is going towards. In Singapore's context, our funding for the sourcing of credits comes directly from the carbon tax that I spoke of. So we do have a budget ring-fenced for this, and it's really for us to look into the details that what is the fair value purchase and what are other companies also paying for it for transition credits. So I think it's quite clear from the presentations you heard today for Singapore, as presented by Ambassador Ravi as well, transition credits for us present a very compelling proposition, not just for us to meet our climate targets, but also they can deliver compelling benefits for the region. So I think many of these has already been covered, but I'll just go through them quite quickly. I think for us, a really important part of this is that one project alone can unlock significant potential, 19 million tons over 10 years. And if you think about the Article 6 credit market today and the supply that is incredibly constrained, we do see that there is a strong pipeline of such projects, and it just takes one pilot project to spark off a potentially very large supply. And not only that large supply, but also we have seen that these projects are very tangible. It's very measurable. Yes, there are definitely risks involved in getting the projects off the ground, but once the plant is decommissioned, actually the supply can be quite certain. So those are advantages that we see in the transition credits. We talked a little bit about pricing as well. Obviously, there is a need for us to signal demand, so a need for buyers to signal early, but also the advantage for us is then to be able to negotiate for preferential rates, especially if we're thinking about a long-term offtake. We're quite certain of the demand we'll need over the next few years. This is something that we also see as an advantage for sovereigns potentially coming in to ink these early agreements. And finally, we talk about risk mitigation. We had a long list of risks earlier. I think that's something that Singapore is thinking very hard about, and for most sovereigns, actually, we tend to pay on delivery, right? We don't tend to take on a lot of that risk. So, I mean, there's several ways that we are looking to mitigate that. One is, of course, through the eligibility criteria. For us, I would say, given that the Vera methodology is already out, it's a methodology that Singapore is now actively assessing to check that it complies with our criteria. Is there anything else we need to study and do in order to make sure that project is compliant before we agree to any offtake? I was also very happy for us to hear that ICBCM is also initiating that work group. All that just contributes to the potential robustness of the projects and the methodology, and altogether raise the market confidence. So that's also an important signal for us. We'll continue to look at other forms of risk mitigation. We won't go into all today, but there was a bit talked about in terms of insurance and other forms of risk mitigation, and all that will have to be considered for sovereign offtake. And finally, of course, the general benefits to the region. I think that's been spoken about, but I think what Singapore is really looking for is how can we be a catalyst for the region's energy transition, to build more energy resilience for the region, and in so doing also facilitate a just transition. And these are really core to why we see huge potential in transition credits. So this will be my final slide, just a short presentation. I think what Singapore is really looking to do now is to move to the next step. We've had a lot of conversation, but the question is how do we get the first pilot project off the ground? Which is why what we are starting to look at now is a form of advanced market commitment. What we have set on the slide is pretty broad. I would say we're still at quite early stage of that discussion, which is why we'd love to jump into this discussion with you, especially if you are representing another sovereign. who is potentially interested to offtake transition credits, or if you're representing a corporate buyer or compliance buyer who's also interested, we would love to hear from you as to what you are looking for in an advanced market commitment type of design, and if this is something that you're open to working with Singapore to potentially make some kind of a joint statement of interest on transition credits. This is something we'd love to explore with you, so please do come speak to us during the networking session. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. For the next segment, I'd like to invite up Nat back on stage, along with Director Wei Wei from Ministry of Trade and Industry for the Q&A. Thank you.
So any questions?
Perhaps an update to everybody, since we're talking about a pilot project in the Philippines that we just had a meeting this morning with the Philippines government. I have USEC, Anna here with me, and we've been talking about not just the implementation agreement, but also looking at new methodologies that can be potentially considered under the implementation agreement. And we are looking into forming a work group to look into new methodologies, including VM52. So this is something that, as Deanna mentioned, we're actively assessing. So this is the update, at least from my end, in terms of how we are being very keen to explore how this can potentially be eligible under the Singapore implementation agreements that we have with other countries. So I'll welcome questions.
Hi, Wei Wei. I guess question is, any updates on the tender and lessons learned? Because I understand you did a tender for procurement of Article 6 credits. Any high-level lessons learned, and then how do you see this panning out for, is it going to be asset class specific, or like forestry tender versus a transition credits tender, or is it going to be a generic carbon credits tender? So maybe just some thoughts on lessons learned based on your first experience, first round, and then how are you thinking about the future? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Eric. I think to give a bit of context to your question, we issued an RFP, a request for proposal, last year for nature-based credits. And what Eric is referring to is, are there lessons learned for the following RFP that MTI is going to issue? We are looking at a timeline of fourth quarter of this year to release our RFP. It's not going to be sector specific. It will be broad-based. So we welcome project developers who are interested to participate in our RFP, which will come out in fourth quarter this year. And it's being led by my team, with Deanna, and there is Gracia, who's here in the audience as well. Feel free to engage us on some of the key aspects that we're looking at. But I would say that some of the key lessons that we have taken away from the first RFP is in terms of commercial considerations. I think that there were some feedback from companies to say that there has been quite a fair bit of risks that we're putting on companies in our first RFP. So we have adjusted that, and I think that it will be something that will be more viable, I hope. But we have actually done quite a lot of industry consultation actually throughout the entire process of coming up with RFP specs. So I don't think that it will be a surprise when it comes out subsequently.
Hi, Nat. One question. Have the coalition's member indicated the price range they're willing to pay to support energy transitions?
We've not directly started on the price negotiations for any one of the pilots. That would be, I think, premature. But we have asked them generally, what do they expect to see in the way we actually framed the question was sort of, what do our companies expect to be paying for high integrity carbon credits in the kind of 2030 to 2035 timeframe? That feels like the right comparison question. And you won't be surprised, we got a range of views back. But I think there was the range was maybe 10 or 20 on the low side, 60 or 70 on the high side, and there was a lot of, I think, a sort of central range, maybe let's say of 30 to 50 or 40 to 60 or something like that. That's not, just want to emphasize, that was sort of a quick survey, and that was but I think what that shows is, that was actually encouraging to us, because when we've talked to Eric and sort of talked about the kind of ranges that would be needed to make the math work out for the SL Tech transaction, it's the same broad kind of range. That's also, when you think about where the Singapore carbon tax might be, in 2030, that's with a view to 50 to 80 Singapore dollars, which is 40 to 60 US in current exchange rate. So it feels like we're around the same range, like folks are kind of converging on that same range. It's not the case that buyers are thinking really, really low, and there's that the sellers would need a much, much higher price. So there's a lot to be done between now and closing a term sheet. But that gave us encouragement that there was a broad alignment between where our buyers see the high integrity market going and where the numbers would be to make the energy transition credits pencil out.
I know that this is a question and answer session, but I thought that just now there was a comment from Vera saying that there's a long queue for ICVCM to assess the methodology. I thought that it could be worth our while to consider if ICVCM, Singapore National Environment Agency, and the Philippines DNR can look into coming together to assess the methodology. And can we speak to ICVCM to accelerate the process of getting ourselves, a little bit more forward in the queue, because there is an actual project that we would like to actually implement this methodology. So I thought that since we have all the people in here in this room, we should be actively considering, an action plan like this. Or I welcome further comments from everybody on how we should be accelerating some of these assessment, because if the corporate buyers are also looking at ICVCM CCP as sort of like a requirement to give them that certainty or to mitigate their risks, then this is the same for the Singapore government, that we would need our National Environment Agency to do the assessment. Since we're all doing something that's quite similar, I think it's worth our while to look at how we can synergize this effort.
I might actually add something on top of that, which is on the demand side. I think that groups like SBTI, we've been trying, as Kinetic, trying to get the word to SBTI from, not get the word to them, but help them understand the position of emerging economies and developing countries that stand to benefit from the climate finance, right? There's too often I think in the kind of NGO world that I come, the non-governmental organization world, the kind of climate community that I come from, it's very kind of in a bubble. And so just as I think your point is great about going to ICVCM and sort of exploring opportunities, I think we're looking for ways to make sure that folks on the corporate accountability side, on SBTI, understand that this is really about driving finance at scale into economic development with just transition benefits, and it's not sort of it's not this thing that's isolated or taken away from the real world. So I think there's a lot to be done on both counts.
One quick question, Garrett Held from ADB. That's for Nat. So with the, let's say, retreat or scaling back of corporate climate commitments we've been witnessing, in particular in the US over the last 6 months, and of course an increasing focus on AI, which is clearly going to change a little bit of some of these commitments. I'm wondering on how the discussions, let's say, with the buyer community in the ETA and now Kinetic have changed and are changing, right? Because again, they have not made any formal commitments yet, and they're basically tagging along. And a related question, you just touched upon this in terms of the engagements with the standard setters, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or SBTI, which you yet have to sort of validate the pathway, right, of making that claim path that you laid out possible. Is there some progress? And do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Because they have been having online, public consultations for quite some time. Thanks.
Yeah, let me address both of those and try to do it quickly because I know we're coming up on time. So the first question was about whether corporates, in particular in the U.S., are maintaining their commitments. This is something not surprising. I think about, you can hear in my accent, I'm from the U.S. I think about this nonstop. But the good news, it's very clear that I think corporates are much less willing to make new big commitments than they were a year or 2, 5 years ago. But every company we talk to, and we actually at C2S, we talk to a lot of companies beyond the ones in Kinetic, every company we talk to remains committed to meeting the targets they've already set. They want to do it head down. They want to do it their way. They often don't want a big splashy news release, but they remain committed. And I think the question about data centers and AI is an interesting one because that is, for at least some of our companies that do have a significant tech presence, or significant tech companies, that's going to increase. That's going to increase the potential, obviously, their demand for electricity and potentially demand for credits. So what we've seen is they remain really committed. They remain eager to be part of the conversation. They're less willing to be in a major press release. And so, for example, one of our goals is to reach a kind of soft commitment, not soft in the sense that it doesn't mean anything, but an initial commitment, kind of towards an advanced market commitment by the end of this year in the case of the Philippines pilot. But we would not announce that, and we would not have a huge press release. We would confirm that and share that with partners, but not make a big deal of it, because I think that's where the companies are. They're committed, they remain committed, but they don't want to make a big public deal about it. With respect to SBTI and GHGP, just quickly, folks will know those processes take a long time. SBTI in particular has been very opaque. I will say that I think David Kennedy has offered some really good new leadership, and every conversation I've had with David is encouraging in general about his sort of approach that he wants to bring towards carbon credits. As folks will know, there's an interdependence between that and Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and that process is moving quite slowly. So I think one of the things we think about and talk about with our companies is how can we move ahead, create space and support for them on this kind of pathway, understanding that GHGP in particular won't be done with their Scope 2 and Scope 3 processes for another 2 years, which is impossible to think of. I don't know how it takes that long, but anyway, the Chatham House, I don't know how it takes them that long, but it's going to take them that long. So we need to move forward in the meantime.
Just to take up on that point that Nat's been making, I think when it comes to corporate demand for carbon credits, there are a set of issues on the supply side and a set of issues on the demand side. The supply side issues have to do with environmental integrity, and we've spoken about ICBCM and so on. I think that is non-negotiable for all our corporates. They want to make sure the stuff they buy is of high integrity. Now, on the demand side, there are all these rules as to when you can buy credits. And I think some of the rules that have been bandied around, okay, SBTI and others, are probably overly restrictive. And I was even struck by Nat's slide where, there's a sectoral dimension and there's a geographic dimension, there's Scope 1 and differentiation within Scope 2. I think if you go down to the basics of what a carbon credit is, it's for 1 ton of CO2 removed or reduced from the atmosphere. Does it matter whether it's in India or the Philippines? Does it matter whether it's Scope 1 or Scope 2? If it's a ton actually verified and removed, and you're prepared to pay $30 or $40 for it, that's what matters. And I think a growing number of corporates are asking for what they call air cover, and governments, I think, need to step in to actually give them guidance on this. This is not an issue about integrity of the credits. This is an issue about national policies, what you allow your corporates to do. And that is why the UK and Singapore earlier this year have both issued specific guidance on when under what circumstances can corporates buy this? You need to exhaust your decarbonization potential. There's a mitigation hierarchy. You need to ensure supply integrity. You need to be encouraged, in our case, to disclose whether there are ratings and so on. I think that's the kind of change we need to see. And we're building up a coalition of countries which will subscribe to this. And if governments, more and more governments can step in to give this kind of guidance, I think that will help give a lot more confidence to corporates. So to the corporates here, I would urge you to lobby your governments to give such guidance and support, and to the government's representatives here to do something on this front, because your corporates are asking for guidance. They want some recognition from the governments as to when they can buy the credits. Then I think some of these restrictive practices need not bind us too much. Yeah, thanks.
With that, thank you, Ned, Wei, and Diana for your sharing, and thanks everyone for your contribution to the discussion on catalyzing demand from both corporate and sovereign buyers. As we come to a close for the day, we are extremely honored to have with us Secretary Sharon Garin from the Department of Energy of the Philippines to deliver our closing address. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Secretary Garin as we invite her on stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and to all the non-Filipinos, welcome to the Philippines. It's a rainy day today, but I think there's a bright things going on indoors here. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge or greet Eric Francia of ASEN, the one who has pushed our department to pursue the carbon credit policy. To Frederick Teo of GenZero, Lim Hui Seng, the Managing Director of and Group Head of Energy, Chemical and Infra of DBS, Ravi Menon, Ambassador of Climate Action and Senior Advisor, New Zealand Ambassador Catherine McIntosh, the President of Kinetic Coalition, Nat Kyoheim, and the CEO of DGA, Shinichiro Suzuki, and Jaime Urquijo, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Ayala Corporation and Board of Director of ASEN. First, allow me to extend my warmest congratulations to our friends, all the companies that are here, and all the organizers for convening this important gathering, for being pioneers in advancing the energy transition here in the Philippines. I also want to thank DBS Bank, whose leadership in sustainable finance continues to inspire not only in Singapore, but across Asia. Today's forum has brought together some of the brightest minds in energy, climate, and finance, and I'm honored to close what has been a very rich and thought-provoking discussion. As many of you know, the Philippine power sector is unique. It is privately owned, unsubsidized, and market-driven. That means the government cannot simply dictate what the private sector should and should not do. This setup brings both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, we have limited levers to force change. On the other hand, we are compelled to find solutions that work because they make sense, not just morally, but commercially. That is how we ensure sustainability in the truest sense. The good news is that our country's very own market structure gives us an advantage. Every step we take to reduce fossil fuel use also reduces our dependence on imported energy. Every renewable energy project we pursue strengthens our energy security while bringing us closer to our climate goals. In short, in the Philippines, what is good for the planet is good for our economy. That is where transition credits come in. They are a brilliant new tool that leverages our market context while creating opportunities for mutual benefit with more developed economies like Singapore, who are in search for bolder decarbonization pathways. For us, transition credits can provide the financial innovation needed to retire coal power plants earlier than expected, while ensuring that new clean energy replaces them. For others, they provide a credible avenue to meet their decarbonization commitments. This is a win-win situation, and it is precisely the kind of solution we need if we are to fulfill our transition journey. But we also recognize that the road ahead is not easy. This is not something that can be done by government alone, especially in the Philippines, nor by private sector acting in isolation. It will require sustained collaboration across governments, regulators, financiers, developers, and communities. At the Department of Energy, our focus is on creating the framework and enabling space for these innovations to thrive. Just yesterday, we published the draft circular on carbon credits for the energy sector in the Philippines. And we are eagerly seeking your feedback on how our policy can best support the kinds of transactions and models we have explored today. But mind you, we drafted the circular on carbon credits, but that is not just, Mr. Francia, that is not the only consequence of carbon credits. We have had to review all our other circulars on the, we are drafting the virtual power purchase agreement. We have had to review our green energy option and green energy auction program because the attribution of the credits have to be consistent. And now also the net metering and the renewable portfolio standards. So we had to review more than what was requested actually. But that is how government should work. We are also fortunate to be working hand in hand with our sister department, the DNR, which I'm told is now led by someone deeply familiar with the energy sector's challenge. It's led by, I think you met him this afternoon. He's my mentor and my former boss, Secretary Lutilla. Our collaboration with the DNR will be vital as we prepare for COP30 in Brazil, in many other milestones that will follow. The transition credits that are not just a local issue, they are part of a global strategy. Let me touch on three elements that come from this concept: the methodology, the financing, and the demand. First, on methodology, transition credits will only succeed if they are seen as credible, transparent, and effective. That means building methodologies that are rigorous enough to stand up to scrutiny, yet practical enough to be applied at scale. It is not enough to simply support the concept. We must achieve consensus on the rules and standards that govern these credits. We must ensure that they genuinely lead to emission reductions and that these reductions are verifiable and lasting. Otherwise, we risk undermining the very integrity of the effort. The Philippines is committed to working with partners like GenZero and ASEN and others to ensure that the methodologies we adopt are sound, protecting both our climate ambition and our credibility in the global marketplace. Second, on financing. Innovations in financing are absolutely critical. In the Philippines, our banks are only beginning to reform their lending practices to meet the demands of the new era. Too often, financing remains tied to the old model, where only generators with long-term power supply agreements can secure the capital they need. This creates a bias towards the status quo, locking us onto outdated systems. But if we are to succeed, energy financing must become more agile, more responsive, and more forward-looking. We need financial institutions that see the transition not as a risk to be avoided, but as an opportunity to be seized. Transition credits can help provide that bridge, creating the conditions where investors, developers, and communities all benefit from moving faster toward clean energy. Lastly, on catalyzing demand. Let us be clear, this initiative is not a one-off pilot. It is a response to a fundamental shift in global markets. Around the world, consumers and corporations are demanding goods and services that are produced with clean energy. Supply chains are being reoriented around sustainability. And increasingly, international trade and investment flows will reward those who are ahead of the curve. The current is moving swiftly and is no longer worthwhile to paddle upstream. Transition credits are a way of positioning ourselves with the current, ensuring that we meet not only today's needs, but also tomorrow's expectations. Of course, we must also be honest about the trade-offs. The costs are real. Retiring coal power plants early, investing in new technologies, and restructuring our financial systems all come with immediate burdens. But these are investments. Investments in a future where our children can breathe cleaner air, where our industries can thrive in a low-carbon world, and where our nation is more resilient and less dependent on imported fuels. These are investments we must take. This is where my optimism comes in. We have heard today from visionaries, the innovators, and the leaders who can transform our energy sector. I have faith that brilliant minds present at every table in this room will catalyze something truly transformative, something that can change not only the trajectory of the Philippines and but also serve as a model for Asia and beyond. As we close this forum, let us remember, the work does not end here. What begins today in Manila should not remain a single event, but become part of a continuing journey, proving that climate ambition and economic growth can and should go hand in hand. Before I close, I just want to advertise my country. The Philippines has been evaluated by Bloomberg Climatoscope, and it is second most attractive country for investments in renewable energy. First is India, second is Philippines, and third is China. We were number one in the fundamentals. We were number one in the policies that we issue. Many foreign companies, 100% foreign-owned companies wanted to invest. We opened it up to 100% ownership. Many companies have had a hard time getting financial closure. We upped the ante with green energy auction. We are now going on our fourth now. Recently, we have had an auction for 2-3 gigawatts of solar, roof-mounted solar, and it's oversubscribed. It's 12 gigawatts participants. We have also made reforms in terms of the market, in terms of our competitive selection process, green energy option, net metering. We have been making reforms even in the applications for service contracts. And that is how we approach today's topic. ASEN and the rest of the companies have shown interest in carbon credits, and we respond accordingly. We understand that we have the same objective. We have the same future that we envision. Getting there might be of different ideas for the government and the private institutions. but I think the performance of the Philippines in renewable energy, I think that shows how effective it is if private and government works together. If government is sensitive to the needs of the private sector, and the private sector behaves as how the government expects it, I think any country can be on top of the list of the Bloomberg evaluation or report. So for that, we are committed in supporting energy transition. We are committed in supporting activities like this, and hopefully we will foster better relations also with Singapore and other countries that want to enter into bilateral agreements with the Philippines. Energy is just the start. Undersecretary Te is here. She's been learning a lot about energy transition. But with the participation of DNR, the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, it will just start with energy, but it will expand to more activities in the Philippines, more transition in the Philippines. So this is just a start. I think this is the catalyst that we need for the Philippines transition to greener energy and cleaner energy. And you are part of the group that has started this movement in the Philippines. For that, we are so grateful for your presence today, for your participation and your interest in helping the Philippines transition to a cleaner and a better energy mix. Maraming salamat at mabuhay po kayong lahat.
Good evening. I don't have a very enviable job coming after Secretary Sharon. And what a wonderful speech. And I think she reminded us of some of the most important reasons for why we are gathered here. I think her 3 points around credibility and integrity, the importance of financing, and the importance of catalyzing demand, I think are useful reminders for us about the work that we have ahead of us. Let me close off this afternoon's proceedings, first of all, by thanking all of you for spending this afternoon with us, for listening, for participating, and for learning together with us about the important task of energy transition and the difficult challenges ahead, but also the opportunities, as Secretary Sharon has reminded us, right, around coal transition. I would also like to express my thanks to all our partners, DBS, ASEN for co-organizing this with us, our JV partners for getting on this journey. I'm reminded that when we first started this, it was actually about a year ago. And it was on the occasion of President Taman's state visit here to the Philippines. And we had the pleasure of actually hosting, I think, our Minister for Sustainability, Grace Fu, as well as then Secretary Tony, to witness the signing of the MOU, where we actually started this JV journey on coal transition. And what a year it has been. And the many milestones and all that, but we are also reminded this is a long-haul marathon, not a short sprint. Huh? So lots of things to do. Now, I think I will close by maybe sharing a couple of perspectives from what I've heard and what I've learned from the many times you're here. Now, first, it's always a pleasure to be back here in the Philippines, right? Now, I don't know whether many of you realize this, but if you can guess, Singapore is an island, Philippines is a collection of islands. But how many islands do you think Singapore actually has? 2? I mean, we are always thinking about Singapore itself and Sentosa, but actually there are lots of other islands. Originally, 60 plus. Some islands have been combined together as some big islands. But you guess how many islands the Philippines actually has? Huh? 20,000, maybe not 20,000, but certainly over 7,500 islands. So it is an archipelagic country. And therefore, it also brings to mind the challenges of actually connecting all of the different island communities up together to provide energy access and to have sustainable development. Compounded by the fact that actually the Philippines has 20 times the population or resident population of Singapore. So the challenge of energy transition is real. And I think we can only admire and respect the kind of ambition and vision that Filipino leadership actually has in trying to actually execute something so difficult, but wanting to actually take a step forward. Now, we are clear that when we are looking at things that are very, very new, leadership is important. If it's already very clear to go this way, you don't need leaders to tell you you have got to do this and do that. You would naturally do it anyways. And when something like that is so new and involves so much money and so much resources, it is particularly important to have strong government leadership, which is what I think Ravi as well as Secretary Sharon has actually emphasized as well. The next thing is actually to understand that the challenge of transition is particularly difficult. If we are starting from a blank sheet of paper, it is much easier to design a sustainable, more forward-looking energy system. But we have to deal with legacy. Now, many of us who have kids, I mean, sometimes you have to help your kids with homework, right? So can you imagine if your 5-year-old or 6-year-old has art class and has decided to, supposed to draw the house or something like that, and then it looks the way it is, and you're thinking, how am I supposed to help make this look a little bit better? Now, believe you me, trying to improve the kids' drawing is way more difficult than if you had to draw that house or that painting right from the start. Why? Because transition is like painting on a painted canvas. It is just that much more difficult to execute. So that means that you have got to take some risks. Now, we are reminded once again that when you are on this journey, it is not about trying to reduce these projects and these project designs to having no risks at all, but it's about how you mitigate that. And with these risks actually come opportunities. I sometimes share this analogy with my guys. I'm sure they're bored about hearing this, but it's exactly like a football team or you're playing sports. If you are totally playing defense, the best that you can hope for is a draw. Because like in soccer, it's 0-0. If you want to win, you've got to go out there and take a chance. Finally, I think we are reminded that it is important for us to think about designing transition projects that are sustainable and scalable. Sustainability must be sustainable. We have got to make this stand on its own legs insofar as the commercial viability is concerned, so that over time, we depend less and less on bespoke interventions, on very, very bespoke support to be able to get this across the line. Now, when we are starting, unfortunately, this is just the way it is. We will need that. But over time, to the extent that we can drive costs down, we can make this simpler. The lessons that we are learning together as this project team, that we are prepared to share with others so that they don't have to pay the lessons and the tuition fees that we have had to go through. It will help everybody do this that much better, and that is the ultimate prize. It's not just about us doing it, it's about so many more people doing it after us and making it so much easier for them to do it. And we have to do it commercially, it's got to do it sustainably, so that there are resources to account for the thousands of coal plants in Asia that needs that transition. So with that, let me thank everyone once again for spending the time with us. This is actually the first time that GenZero is holding one of our climate conferences outside Singapore. I'm so delighted to be able to have your support and the cooperation and partnership with so many of our friends here in the Philippines. It is, like Secretary has said, the Philippines is one of the best places for us to actually get this thing done. So that's the reason why we are here. In fact, that's the first coal transition project that we are embarking on within the Temasek family and within GenZero. So thank you very much once again, and I look forward to meeting more of you at the networking session later. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And once again, thank you, Secretary Garin. On that note, we have come to the end of the GenZero Climate Summit 2025 Transition Credits Forum. A sincere thank you to all guests from the Philippines and for those who have flown in down to Manila, especially for this event. On behalf of ASEAN, DBS Bank, and GenZero, we thank you for joining us today. We welcome continued exchanges among participants following the event. In keeping with the closed-door nature of the deep dive discussions, we ask that their content not to be shared on social media. We invite you to continue the conversations at Mistral later this evening. For guests attending the dinner networking reception with us, please look out for our ushers just outside the ballroom. They will be guiding you to Mistral rooftop bar, which is located at level 10 of this building. You will need to take a lift down to the ground floor and transfer to a separate lift up to Mistral. We look forward to continuing the evening with you at the rooftop bar. For now, Have a wonderful evening ahead, and we look forward to hosting you at the next GenZero Climate Summit. Thank you, everyone.